everybody. Over the course of the past few months, I've done a big standard series. I have done a deck tech on every single standard deck that I think is playable. And whether you're just getting into standard or want to review or just want to see all of the different decks and me talk about them, this video is for you. This is a compilation of every single deck tech I have done for the standard that is going on right now. Enjoy. This is the Esper Self-Bounce deck, and what this deck is attempting to do is utilize permanents that do something beneficial when they enter the battlefield, and then sit there, and then use other cards to return those permanents to our hands so that we can replay them. And you do this enough times, and you can reuse cards over and over, eventually wildly outcard our opponent, and win the game. This deck is divided up into a few categories, so let me split those up right now. So these are the categories I would kind of define in the deck. We have cards that return stuff to our hand. We have cards that do stuff when they enter the battlefield and we want returned to our hand. And then two miscellaneous categories. We're playing some Go for the Throat just as removal, and then Mockingbird to copy any of the creatures in either of these categories. So let's go through the permanents that we want to keep returning first. We have Defiled Crypt and Cadaver Lab. Cadaver Lab we're going to play in most of the time. When you unlock this door, return target creature card from graveyard to your hand. Being able to do this over and over because we keep returning Cadaver Lab to our hand is great because it means when they deal with the creatures, they are not dealt with forever. Nowhere to Run is a flash enchantment. When it enters, target creature gets -3/-3 till end of turn, and creatures our opponent control can be the target spells or abilities, although they didn't have hexproof, and ward abilities of those creatures don't trigger. That line of text isn't hyper relevant, though it is a little relevant sometimes, but mostly -3/-3 kills most creatures. Hopeless Nightmare, when it enters, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life, which recurring that over and over is pretty solid. And when it's put in the graveyard from the battlefield, scry 2. And we can just pay 3 mana to sacrifice Hopeless Nightmare. We aren't going to do that very often because we'd rather return it to our hand and just keep replaying it to deal 2 damage and have our opponents discard cards and just keep them empty-handed. Playing a Storm Chaser's Talent, which I think is the most powerful card in the deck. It's a class where the first level of the class lets you create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess, which is excellent. So a lot of what this is going to do, we're going to keep returning Storm Chaser's Talent, keep creating 1/1s with prowess, and because most of the cards in our deck cost so little, these 1/1s are very often 3/3s or 4/4s when we actually attack with them. However, we can level it up from 4 mana and have it become level 2, return target instant sorcery card from a graveyard to our hand. Pretty good. And it's level 3 for 6 mana is whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. Again, most of the time, we're just going to keep it on level 1, sometimes level 2, and extremely rarely level 3. Playing Optimistic Scavenger is a 1 mana 1/1 with Eerie whenever enchantment you control enters. And whenever you fully unlock a room, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So we're not going to be bouncing this super often, but we have so many enchantments in our deck that we're going to be returning to our hand and then replaying. This lets our creatures just get ridiculously large. And we're playing a single Sheltered by Ghosts. Returning this is fine if it hits a token. However, Sheltered by Ghosts, very, very good against the red deck, which is important to have some play against the red deck because we run a lot of pain lands in the Esper version, and it's like quite decent removal. Now, we're going to be returning these cards with these cards. So Kaido allows us to ninjutsu, where when a creature is not blocked, we can turn that creature to our hand and have Kaido entered attacking, and it's a 3/4 ninja and with hexproof. And then it's also a planeswalker where you get to do all these things. However, returning these creatures like Fear of Isolation, Nurturing Pixie, and Optimistic Scavenger, sometimes Mockingbird certainly, allows us to reuse those effects and then also just have a planeswalker for only 3 mana, which is excellent. This Town Ain't Big Enough is a 5 mana spell that says return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. However, it becomes 2 mana if it targets a permanent you control. Sometimes you want to target 2 permanents you control, but very often you're going to return like a threat your opponent has on the battlefield, return 1 of these things to your hand and then replay it, or return 2 of these things to your hand and replay it. Playing Fear of Isolation. As an additional cost to cast a spell, return a permanent you control as owner's hand. You see how that interacts. And it's a 2/3 with flying. And Nurturing Pixie is a 1 mana 1/1 with flying. When Nurturing Pixie enters, return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If a permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. So it gets bigger, it becomes effectively a 1 mana 2/2, and we return these things and replay them again, and things just get absolutely insane. And remember, like, this town ain't big enough, Fear of Isolation, you know, all that stuff, they can return each other as well, so you can continue to benefit off of these bounce effects. And you see how this deck just kind of combos with itself is able to recur most of its cards and reuse its cards over and over and just completely outcard and outvalue the opponent just by returning these enchantments over and over. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, Destroy Evil, very good against enchantments and things with toughness 4 or greater. I'm thinking like Shieldred or like Leyline Binding decks. Rest in Peace, important graveyard hate. Sheltered by Ghosts, mostly for the red deck. It giving lifelink is a really, really big deal. Negate. Pest control decks can be kind of annoying. But really, it's kind of obvious when Negate comes in. Cut down again for the aggressive decks, because aggressive decks can be rough, because again, we're running a lot of pain lands, and they don't really care about the value we're getting. Witch's Vitality is a pretty decent recurring removal spell for decks that play creatures with mana value 2 or less, like aggressive decks. And then Normalize just as some more counter magic against decks with very high impact cards. So this is the red-green aggro deck. It's pretty much what it says on the tin. It's playing some very, very cheap creatures to be as aggressive as possible and then finish opponent off with burn spells. Or I guess a burn spell. As far as the lands go, there's not a lot to talk about as red-green lands. I guess the big thing is Rockface Village. You can't use the red mana to cast a non-creature spell. However, it taps for waste, and then you can pay red and tap it to have target lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn and activate only as a sorcery. This is decent at face value, where it's just giving most of your creatures are one of those things and just giving them haste and all that stuff. But the cool part about it, ooh, I killed a burst lightning. There we go, got it back. The cool part about it is we have creatures in our deck that have Valiant. So for example, Heartfire Hero is a 1-mana 1/1. Mouse Soldier, so it's a mouse, so it can be targeted with Rockface Village. And whenever Heartfire Hero becomes a target of spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So that includes Rockface Village. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So if you have the mana for it, you can target Heartfire Hero every turn and have it grow every turn. Similar to Emberheart Challenger. Emberheart Challenger is a 2-mana 2/2 with haste and prowess. Already a decent card, but it has Valiant. When it becomes a target of spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library until end of turn. You may play that card. That includes Rockface Village, so you can just draw an extra card every single turn when you have Emberheart Challenger and Rockface Village. So there's combos alongside combos with that card. As far as other aggressive creatures we're playing Hired Claw. It's a 1-mana 1/2 lizard, so that counts with Rockface Village. Whenever you attack with one or more lizards, Hired Claw deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you can pay 2 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on Hired Claw. Activate only if an opponent has lost life this turn and only once each turn. Just a very aggressive creature. Remember, it triggers on attack, so you can activate in blockers, because if something's blocking it, that means it has attacked and has dealt a damage. So it's a little bit bigger than it is on face value, and just having mana up and threatening that means your opponent sort of has to respect it. We're playing Pawpatch Recruit as a 2 of. It's a 1-mana 2/1 with Offspring 2. Offspring meaning you can pay an extra 2 mana to create a 1/1 token that's a copy of Pawpatch Recruit. Has Trample, and whenever a creature you control becomes a target of spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. So this is really good when we're trying to flood the board of the creatures and your opponent has removal spells. They try to remove one creature, we have a Pawpatch Recruit, or even better, a Pawpatch Recruit with an Offspring of Pawpatch Recruit, and we just get to put +1/+1 counters on other creatures, which also, by the way, triggers Valiant, like we just talked about. We're also playing Manifold Mouse, is a 2-mana 1/2 with Offspring 2. We already talked about Offspring. At the beginning of combat in your turn, target mouse you control gains your choice of Double Strike or Trample until end of turn. Almost always you're going to be selecting Double Strike, but Manifold Mouse without paying mana or relying on our opponent like Pawpatch Recruit allows us to trigger Valiant every single turn. So there are games that you play turn 1 Heartfire Hero, turn 2 Manifold Mouse, target Heartfire Hero, make it bigger, give it Double Strike, swing for 4. Next turn, trigger Manifold Mouse, target Heartfire Hero, make it bigger. It's a 3/3 now with Double Strike, swing for 6. That is like a normal play pattern. We're also playing Questing Druid. Questing Druid, we're really playing for the adventure side of it. Seek the Beast, where it's an instant where we can exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until your next end step, you may play those cards. So this is a way to allow us to go really long if they answer our initial aggro. And then its front side is you can just cast it, and it's a 1/1. Whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, put a +1/+1 counter on Questing Druid. Most of these cards are red, so we're putting +1/+1 counters on it. It just becomes a beast over time if it's not answered. And then Screaming Nemesis is a 3-mana 3/3 with haste. Whenever Screaming Nemesis is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target. If a player is dealt damage this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. So Screaming Nemesis is incredibly difficult to block, especially when you're under threat of Monstrous Rage or Snakeskin Veil, which we'll get to in just a second. And if they do deal with it with damage, or if it's blocked, you can either kill a creature or deal that damage to the face, and then you don't have to worry about your opponent gaining life, which is the bane of these red aggressive decks anyway. As far as non-creatures, we're playing 4 Burst Lightning. Burst Lightning is an awesome shock, or we can pay 5 mana total to deal 4 damage, which can either finish off our opponent or get things out of the way. We're playing 4 Monstrous Rage. Is a 1-mana instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. You create a Monster Roll token attached to it. Monster Roll gives +1/+1 in Trample. So really, this gives +3/+1 in Trample. And then the +1/+1 in Trample sort of stays on it. And this is just really good to obviously, like, at face value, to like get over creatures that are blocking. If they're blocking like perfect power and toughness, you can make the toughness bigger so your creature survives and stuff tramples over. It also triggers Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger's Valiance. And if they block a Screaming Nemesis thinking they're going to kill it and Monstrous Rage saves it, some amount are going to trample, and then also the damage that is dealt to Screaming Nemesis, even if it's not lethal, you get to trigger Screaming Nemesis for, which is absolutely disgusting. Snakeskin Veil protects our creatures. 1 mana, put a +1/+1 counter target creature you control against hexproof until end of turn. It makes things bigger. It protects from opponents' removal spells. Specifically, like, also triggers Heartfire Hero, targets Emberheart Challenger, can make Screaming Nemesis bigger in combat, or really make anything bigger in combat, but really make Screaming Nemesis bigger in combat. So can it survive? It can survive and then still deal damage to stuff. We're playing 3 Innkeeper's Talent. Innkeeper's Talent is a 2-mana enchantment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Again, triggers Valiant in these mice. Also, just like making our creatures bigger every single combat is pretty gross. I can level it up to have permanents I control with counters on them, get ward 1, which is pretty solid. It combos with itself. Also, it combos, like, even if you don't put Innkeeper's counter tokens on, or counters on them, combos with Questing Druid and Heartfire Hero that have counters on them already, and even Hired Claw that has counters on them already. And then you can pay 4 mana to level it up to level 3, where if you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or a player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on the permanent or player, which means every single combat you put 2 +1/+1 counters on things. Snakeskin Veil puts 2. Whenever Heartfire Hero or Questing Druid get counters, they get 2. Just gross. Or again, I keep forgetting about Hired Claw, but Hired Claw as well. So in the main deck, you are being as aggressive as possible, making your creatures really big, comboing off of these Valiant things, and just trying to beat your opponent quickly. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 3 Lithomanic Barrage, mostly for the Dimir deck, also decent against the white deck. Torch the Tower is really good against other aggressive decks, also decent against the Enduring cards, being able to exile them so they don't come back. We're playing 2 Scorching Shot, dealing 5 damage to target creature. Really good against opposing Shieldreds, especially as Shieldred is gaining more stock than the Demon in the black decks. But really, it's good against any deck that their plan is to block our creatures. We're playing 3 Urbrass Forge. Urbrass Forge is excellent against decks that want to go really long against us. And the longer they go, the bigger Urbrass Forge gets, and it's really hard for them to answer. We're playing 3 Paw Patch Formation for an answer to the Demon, also an answer to enchantments, so like the domain deck or whatever. And then if there's nothing on the battlefield, it can just replace itself and make a food, which is also totally fine. And then we're playing the 4th Questing Druid in the sideboard to side in against decks similar to Urbrass Forge, where that are likely going to answer our primary game plan, and we need to be able to draw cards and go really long and have like grindy cards. So this is a stock mono red aggro list in Standard. What this deck is attempting to do is play hyper aggressive creatures, get some mouse synergies that we'll talk about here in a second, pump their creatures up, and then after your opponent deals with the creatures, then be able to burn face and get the rest of the way there. There's a lot of like small weird nuances with this deck that I'm going to attempt to mention, but really this is an aggro deck. Like, you're trying to defeat your opponent and as fast as possible. So we'll start with the lands, playing a bunch of mountains, just so we can cast all of our spells, and 4 Rockface Village. Rockface Village is really sweet in a lot of ways. Basically, you can only spend red mana to cast creature spells, or it produces a waste mana. You can pay red and tap it. Tap target lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon you control, get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn, but you can activate this only as a sorcery. The reason this is good isn't necessarily to give +1/+0 in haste. Well, that's pretty nice on like Hired Claw or Heartfire Hero or Manifold Mouse or whatever, but is to trigger Valiant in Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. Valiant is like Heroic, except it counts for abilities as well, and you can only do it once per turn. So if you use Rockface Village to target Heartfire Hero or Emberheart Challenger, it triggers that Valiant ability, and being able to do that with a land without investing a spell like Monstrous Rage is really, really nice. We're playing 4 Burst Lightning, be able to get other small creatures and cheap creatures out of the way, but also a way to burn face to get that last bit of damage. We're playing 4 Heartfire Hero. It is a mouse soldier. The mouse part is really important. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with Valiant. When it becomes a target, a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So once it's been pumped up, it's pretty hard to block. Again, when you target things either with Monstrous Rage or Rockface Village or Manifold Mouse or anything like that, a Heartfire Hero gets that Valiant trigger and just grows over time, which is really, really sweet. We're playing Hired Claw. Hired Claw is something that kind of passed me by when it got printed, but it plays much better than it reads. It is a 1-mana 1/2 Lizard Mercenary. So again, you can target with Rockface Village, but it doesn't have Valiant. Whenever you attack with 1 or more lizards, Hired Claw deals 1 damage to target opponent. You can pay 2 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on Hired Claw. Activate only if an opponent lost life this turn and only once each turn. So it's a way to dump mana. It's a way to deal damage. It's a solid 1-drop. It's effectively a 2-power 1-drop. It's just the damage is separated. And if you have extra mana, it can grow over time, which is really solid. We're playing 4 Monastery Swiftspear. It is a 1-mana 1/2 with haste and prowess. It is modern playable, so of course it's standard playable. It deals damage quick, deals damage effectively, and we have a lot of non-creature spells to be able to trigger that prowess. We're playing 4 Monstrous Rage, which might be the best card in the deck. It's a 1-mana instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Create a monster roll token attached to it. That monster roll token gives +1/+1 and trample. So the turn this is played, it effectively gives +3/+1 and trample, which is great. Being able to protect any of these creatures, being able to like capitalize on the double strike from Manifold Mouse, being able to like trample over when people think that they're able to like block effectively. It's especially good on Screaming Nemesis. When people block with it, think they're going to kill it, and then they don't kill it, but also Screaming Nemesis triggers, which is disgusting. We'll talk about that in just a second. But also the monster roll token stays on the creature. It is a absolute disgusting card. Also triggers Valiant, which is pretty relevant as well. Speaking of Valiant, the other Valiant card in our deck, the Emberheart Challenger, is a 2-mana 2/2 with haste and prowess. Already really solid and really aggressive, but also is Valiant, where when it becomes a target of spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. So this is a way for us to get card advantage. We can use Monstrous Rage, we can use Rockface Village, we can use Manifold Mouse to target Emberheart Challenger and be able to dig through our deck while being super, super aggressive. Playing 4 Lightning Strike, same role as Burst Lightning, just 1 more mana, sometimes better, sometimes worse. Playing 4 Manifold Mouse, and this is where a lot of the nuances with the deck sort of come in. It's a 2-mana 1/2, but it has Offspring for an additional 2 mana, so you can pay 4 mana for this card to also have a 1/1 token that's a copy of Manifold Mouse, or you can pay 2 mana for it just to be a 1/2. And at the beginning of combat in your turn, target mouse you control gains your choice of Double Strike or Trample till end of turn. Almost always you're going to be selecting Double Strike. So this is already really good in an aggressive deck, especially on top of a Heartfire Hero that's really big, or a prowessed up guy, Hired Claw, maybe something we Monstrous Rage, a Double Striker. Like, those are kind of obvious synergies. But also remember, this is an ability, so it triggers Valiant on Emberheart Challenger and Heartfire Hero. Manifold Mouse can have you draw an additional card every single turn if you just target Emberheart Challenger with it. It can make Heartfire Hero get bigger every single turn, and also have Double Strike, so it makes it even harder to block every single turn if they just sit there. So it makes your other mouse creatures a must answer, or Manifold Mouse to must answer, which if you pay 4 mana for it, it's really hard to must answer 2 cards. The card is absolutely excellent. A really common 1/2 is Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse, target Heartfire Hero, trigger Valiant, swing for 4, which is crazy. It's crazy good. Screaming Nemesis is a 3-mana 3/3 with haste. Whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target. If a player is dealt damage this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. That last little bit, it's a Boros Reckoner with haste and easier to cast, besides the can't gain life for the rest of the game. That is disgusting, which means you can really aggressively attack with it, especially if your opponents have really big creatures, because if they have that demon that's 6/6 and you jam with it, they block, your thing dies, but also you're dealing 6 damage to not only your opponent, but any other target. It could be a creature, a planeswalker, or anything that is really, really scary. And if you deal it to the opponent, they can't gain life for the rest of the game, which is exactly what the mono red deck wants. Something very relevant is that, remember, you can target Screaming Nemesis with your own stuff. So if you want to Burst Lightning your opponent for damage, you might as well Burst Lightning the Screaming Nemesis and make the opponent never gain life, because the 2 damage still goes to the opponent. It'll just never, ever gain life. Another really relevant play is Witchstalker Frenzy in your own Screaming Nemesis to deal 5 damage to your opponent, and turn Witchstalker Frenzy into a 1 mana deal 5, which is also really, really gross. Kills Screaming Nemesis, but often kills your opponent as well. Speaking of Witchstalker Frenzy, it is a 4 mana instant. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attacked this turn. It deals 5 damage to target creature. So we're going to be attacking with a lot of creatures. We have a lot of creatures. This is a way to get big things out of the way. It is just a really solid card. Also, that combo of Screaming Nemesis is gross. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 2 Lithomantic Barrage. Really good against the Dimir deck and the different white decks, being able to deal 5 damage to a white or blue creature or planeswalker. We're playing 4 Torch the Tower, a really good answer to the white Enduring, but also just a solid answer to other aggressive decks. Playing 3 Twisted Fealty for those big, stupid demons. Playing 3 Urbrass Forge for decks that answer our aggression easier than other decks. And so you're able to play this on turn 3 and have it go really long, and it's really hard to answer. The 4th Witchstalker Frenzy for decks that have a lot of blockers that Witchstalker Frenzy can kill. And 2 Sunspine Links, a 4 mana 5/4. Players can't gain life, damage can't be prevented. And when Sunspine Links enters, it deals damage each player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. Really good against decks that are looking to gain life. Really good against decks that don't play a lot of basics like Domain. So this is the standard Domain deck. Effectively, what this deck is attempting to do is just play very powerful, sometimes undercosted cards in order to draw a ton of cards off of Up the Beanstalk. And the way we do that is by casting Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Overlord of the Flood Pit, and Overlord of the Mistmoors, because even if we pay the impending cost, it's still considered to be a card that costs 5 or more, because Up the Beanstalk says when it enters and when you cast a spell mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. So even if I'm paying 3 mana for Overlord of the Hauntwoods, it is still a 5 mana card, so I still draw a card off of Up the Beanstalk. So Overlord of the Hauntwoods is a 5 mana 6/5 with impending 4, meaning that it enters as an enchantment with 4 impending counters on it. You take impending counters off of it at the beginning of each end step. Or actually, I guess they're called time counters, but whatever. And when the last one is removed, it becomes a creature. And whenever it enters or attacks, create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type, which also helps with our domain and fixes our colors, all of that stuff. Overlord of the Flood Pits is a 5 mana 5/3 with impending 4 with flying, and when it enters or attacks, draw 2 cards and discard a card, because again, it will trigger Up the Beanstalk. And Overlord of the Mistmoors is a 7 mana 6/6 with impending 4 for 4 mana, and whenever Overlord of the Mistmoors enters or attacks, create 2/2 white insect creature tokens with flying. All of these things, even when cast for their cheaper costs, trigger Up the Beanstalk. So you're getting a ton of value off of playing these creatures for really cheap. They all do really relevant stuff when they enter, but also they're drawing you more cards with Up the Beanstalk. In addition, similar thing with Leyline Binding. Leyline Binding is a 6 mana card that's enchantment with flash that when it enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield. It's effectively a flash O-ring. However, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. And so that means if we have Overlord of the Hauntwoods, then Leyline Binding costs 1. But even if we're paying 1 mana for Leyline Binding, it still triggers Up the Beanstalk. And so we're drawing a ton of cards and getting a great amount of value off of all of these cards. In addition to that, there is an additional combo with these cards with Zur Eternal Schemer. Zur Eternal Schemer is a 3 mana 1/4 with flying. Enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. Okay, that's on its surface, that sounds really good. Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Overlord of the Mistboards, and Overlord of the Flood Pits are all enchantment creatures, so having Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof with Zur Eternal Schemer on the battlefield is great. However, there's an additional ability. It's for 1 white and 1 generic, target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and base toughness equal to its mana value. So way this works is if you impend one of these creatures It is not a creature. It is just an enchantment. However, it can be targeted with Zur. So for example, if you have an Overlord of the Mistmoors, you pay its impending, you get those 2/2/1 insects, and then you play a Zur Eternal Schemer and target the impended Overlord of the Mistmoors, it will become a 7/7 creature that still has that text that when it enters or attacks, create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. Also, as long as Zur is on the battlefield, creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. So you'll be able to target this enchantment with Zur and attack with Overlord of the Mistmoors and trigger its attack trigger as well. That's also true with Overlord of the Hauntwoods and Overlord of the Flood Pits. And if Zur is dealt with, then these creatures remain creatures even if they still have impending counters on them. The reason I put Leyline Binding into this category as well is creating a 6/6 out of like no creature is pretty good. The issue with doing it to Leyline Binding is if Leyline Binding's dealt with, then they get the thing back, so it's a little bit harder. But they effectively have to, unless they have a board wipe, I guess, they effectively have to deal with Zur first because it also gives these enchantments hexproof, which is pretty powerful. So that's the core of the deck, and the rest is to sort of support that. So we have removal in Get Lost. It's a pretty unconditional removal for planeswalkers, enchantments, and creatures. However, when it destroys those things, it creates 2 map tokens. We have a single Elspeth Smite. Some decks are playing 2 in the main deck. This is mostly for the aggressive decks. It's a 1-mana instant. Elspeth Smite deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. We're playing a single split up. Choose 1, destroy all tap creatures, destroy all untapped creatures against the aggressive-ish decks that you might be playing against. This normally wipes the board for 3 mana. And then we're playing 2 Sunfall. Sunfall, 5 mana, exile all creatures, incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way. And when you incubate, you get an incubator token with X+1/+1 counters on it, and 2 mana transform it into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. So these are all of the removal, and then to support the rest of the deck and add additional power, we're playing 2 Analyze the Pollen. Analyze the Pollen is a 1-mana sorcery. As additional cost to cast a spell, you may collect Evidence 8, which is just exile cards with a total mana value of 8 or greater from your graveyard, which is pretty easy because we have a lot of cards that cost a lot. Plus, we have a ridiculous amount of Surveil lands because those are the dual lands that are domain colors. And it says, search your library for a basic land card. If evidence was collected, instead search your library for a creature or land card. Reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So this fixes our mana, which is awesome. That's important in effectively a 4-color deck. But also, if we collect evidence, we can grab a creature. Grabbing that creature, it could be a Zur, it could be one of these overlords. If you're grabbing it with Analyze, it's normally the white overlord because that's the most powerful. But also we're running a 1 of Atraxa that we can grab with Analyze the Pollen. That is a 7-mana flying vigilance, death touch, lifelink. When it enters, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So this can just kind of end the game all at once, which is so good. And we're playing a 1 of Herd Migration. Herd Migration is a 7-mana spell with domain. Create a 3/3 green beast creature token for each basic land type among basic lands you control. And you can pay 2 mana and discard Herd Migration. Search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, and you gain 3 life. So it's mana fixing, and it can sort of end the game in the deep late game. As far as the lands go, really we're just trying to be able to cast all of our spells. We're effectively 4 color. We can fix our mana a little bit with Cavern of Souls, and really all we need to do is cast a single Overlord of the Hauntwoods, and it fixes our color pretty good. We're effectively a green-white deck that are splashing black and blue, and then a little bit splashing red, even though we don't have red spells, red for the Leyline Binding. And in that sense, we're just making sure we have the best mana possible. As far as the sideboard goes, we have Authority of the Consuls for these aggressive decks and Convoke decks. Elspeth Smite again for these aggressive decks. Rest in Peace is our Graveyard Hate. Split Up is mostly for aggressive decks, but really things that have a lot of creatures that end up tapped and they plan on attacking with. Beza is pretty solid against mid-range, but is mostly for aggro and gaining life and being a blocker. Negate for decks that have non-creature spells we care about. Tear Asunder for enchantment hate. Also like fine if we want additional hate for other permanents, because it only costs 2 more mana and this is a big mana deck anyway. We're playing Tranquil Frillback for enchantment hate. Also decent against aggro because it's a blocker and can gain life, and it's decent graveyard hate. We're playing Anissa Ascended Animus. Most of the time we're siding this in for enchantment hate, or we're siding it in just as a finisher against decks that go really, really long. And then we're playing a single Doppelgang for super, super slow decks, which frankly, if we do this for X is 2 even, it normally ends the game because you can target your opponent's stuff and your stuff. So this is a pretty stock Dimir mid-range list. Now, what this deck is basically attempting to do is remove your opponent's creatures with these black removal spells, attack with these really cheap, hard to block creatures, tap down creatures so that you can keep attacking, counterspell the important stuff, and then capitalize on these really, really cheap, sometimes flash creatures and being able to get blockers out of the way with Enduring Curiosity and Kaido. So let's go by mana costs and talk about these cards. So we're playing Dimir lands, obviously, with Restless Reef and Soulstone Sanctuary. Both of them are decent man lands. There's not a ton of synergy as far as like the mill thing with Restless Reef or anything, but they're just powerful man lands to continue that attacking because we're a tempo deck. Our cards are not super powerful, but we can be significantly more mana efficient. Playing Spygrass Siren is a 1 mana 1/1. When it enters, create a map token. So we can capitalize on the map, and when we return it to our hand with something like Kaido, then we can replay it and keep capitalizing on the map. It's hard to block, so it capitalizes on Enduring Curiosity as well. And then we have Cut Down, mostly for aggressive decks and kind of the mirror match to be able to take out those small creatures. Playing Fairy Mastermind, it's a 2 mana 2/1 with Flash Flying. Whenever opponent draws their second card, each turn you draw a card, and you can pay 4 mana to have each player draw a card. So obviously the ability capitalizes on itself, but this is also excellent against the Unholy Annex. Like it's so good against that. It's really good in the mirror match, you know, to counter Enduring Curiosity. It's even better in multiples because each individual Fairy Mastermind has its own trigger, and it's hard to block, and it has flash, so it plays at instant speed very well. Something else that has flash is Floodpit's Drowner, is a 2 mana 2/1 with flash and vigilance. When it enters, tap target creature and opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And you can pay 2 mana and tap it and shuffle Floodpit's Drowner and target creature with a stun counter into their owner's libraries. So it is a way to deal with an opponent's creature. It costs 4 mana total, so that's pretty tough. It's a way to stop things from attacking so much, and it's a way to get things out of the way to continue to attack, and it has vigilance in and of itself. So it can attack and then also still activate the ability, which is very strong. And its main job is to get things out of the way, even if it's not evasive. Playing Spell Stutter, a 2 mana counter target spell, and this controller pays 2, plus an additional 1 for each fairy you control. And we only have 1 fairy in our deck and Fairy Mastermind. So it's kind of like a mana leak sometimes. Anoint with Affliction, exile target creature, mana value 3 or less, or if the corrupted thing doesn't matter, it's just a 3 or less thing. Just solid removal spell, especially something that doesn't trigger Heartfire Hero and whatever. Go for the Throat, just pretty unconditional removal. And then Shieldred's Edict is a way to cleanly deal with like Planeswalkers and whatnot. We're playing 1 Fabloom Trick as a 3 mana instant, create 2 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying, which, by the way, combos with Spell Stutter. When you do, tap target creature and opponent controls, so you're able to tap things down so you keep attacking. Also creates these fairies to be able to have these evasive threats. Tishana's Tinebiter is a 3 mana 3/2 with flash, so it plays at instant speed really well, which this deck already wants to do. Counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If the ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent lose all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebiter remains on the battlefield. It's a great way to counter more things on the stack, just not necessarily spells. And again, plays at instant speed and is a good creature on its own. And then here are the 2 big payoffs, Enduring Curiosity and Kaido. Enduring Curiosity is a 4 mana 4/3 with flash. Again, flash, instant speed. Awesome. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. When Enduring Curiosity dies, if it was a creature, return to the battlefield under its owner's control. It's an enchantment. So this is really good alongside all these evasive threats and these things that get rid of blockers, whether they be removal spells or Floodpit's Drowner or Flavor Trick that tap things down. Evasiveness like Spygrass Siren and Fairy Mastermind. Hitting your opponent, even with really small creatures, allows you to draw more cards and be able to just have a fistful of either removal spells or more creatures to drive in more cards or blockers or things like that to interrupt what your opponent's doing is so good. And Enduring Curiosity is very hard to answer because one of the best block removals for the Enduring cards is Anoint with Affliction, doesn't hit Enduring Curiosity, and it'll come back and just be an enchantment that like Biden of Thassa. And then Kaido, which is a 4 mana planeswalker that starts at 4 loyalty, and it has ninjutsu, which means if there's an unblocked creature, you can return that creature to your hand, and Kaido enters tapped and attacking, and it has hexproof during your turn. And he's a 3/4 ninja. So you're able to do that, but that already combos with things. Already that's a pretty powerful thing. You can get him out on turn 3 by ninjutsuing Kaido, but also you can capitalize on these enter the battlefield effects again by returning Spygrass Siren. You can get another map when you replay it. You can get another Tishana's Tideminder trigger off of it. You can get another Flood Tishana trigger off of it. It is just very, very good. And then its abilities are very good as well. You know, the emblem and ninjas you control get +1/+1, which means it gives itself +1/+1. 0 Surveil 2, then draw a card for each opponent who lost life this turn, which kind of already happens because you're attacking so much and you have evasiveness and getting things out of the way, like we've already talked about. And then it's -2, tap target creature, put 2 stun counters on it, which works with the strategy of the rest of the deck, especially good against Archfiend of the Dross, because it means they're not killing you with Archfiend of the Dross, which means they might die to Archfiend of the Dross. So that's the overall strategy of the main deck. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 2 Negate to tackle these non-creature spells, another Tishana's Tidebinder for really scary things. I'm thinking like Atraxa and whatever. The 4th Cut Down to be able to deal with those aggro decks of small creatures. Duress for non-creature spells. Preacher of the Schism as a 4/of kind of changes the tone of the deck. It lets us be a little bit more mid-range where we need to be. And kind of it's almost like we shift into a mid-range deck if we know our primary strategy isn't going to work. 2 Shieldred the Apocalypse also helps with that mid-range transformational sideboard. Gix's Command, very good against these aggressive decks. And Ghost Vacuum is our graveyard hate. So this is the current version of Golgari midrange. It's gone through quite a few iterations recently, responding to the meta mostly. And its overall strategy is exactly what a black midrange deck strategy is. It's attempting to 1-for-1 their opponent, come out on top in major exchanges, and play creatures that are just higher card quality and more threatening, and do a little bit more than what they do on face value, so the 1-for-1s are worth it. It is fair Magic in a nutshell, so let's talk about the cards. Starting with the lands. The lands are just basic black-green lands. However, there are 4 2/2 of utility lands. First off, in Fountain Port. Fountain Port, you can tap to add a waste mana, or 2 mana and tap it to sacrifice token and draw a card, 3 mana and tap it to pay 1 life, create a 1/1 blue fish creature token, and 4 mana and tap it to create a treasure token. Fountain Port's just a really good way to use that extra mana to create fish, draw a few extra cards, maybe create a treasure. And Soulstone Sanctuary is, you can tap it to add a waste mana. You can pay 4 mana, and this land's become a 3/3 creature with vigilance, and all creature types, it is still a land. What's cool about that, and maybe not cool about that if you're playing against board wipes, I guess, is that it does not stop being a creature at end of turn like a lot of cards like this do. So you only have to invest mana into it once, and then you can keep attacking with it. And it's very, very strong. As far as 1 mana cards go, we're playing Cut Down just against these aggressive decks, destroying a creature with total power and toughness 5 or less. And we're playing 4 Llanowar Elves to ramp our mana and just get out ahead of our opponents, which is another way that these 1-for-1 decks can win the game. Anoint with Affliction is very good again against these small creatures, but also is a really clean answer to the white enduring creature. Go for the Throat is pretty much an unconditional removal because there's not a lot of playable artifacts. Mosswood Dread Knight on one side is Dread Whispers, where you draw a card and lose a life, and then it goes on an adventure, and then you can play Mosswood Dread Knight, which is a 2-mana 3/2 with trample. When it dies, you may cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. So this is a card that if they don't exile or play a card like Anoint with Affliction, you can just keep casting over and over, keep drawing cards, keep providing threats. This is kind of exactly what a deck like this needs, where if the rest of the deck is 1-for-1ing, this is the kind of card that can get you ahead of it, where it can 1-for-0 your opponent, continue to draw cards, continue to be a threat. Terra Sunder as a 1-of just has artifact or enchantment hate, and it's also fine to play in the main deck because even if they don't have artifacts or enchantments, you can pay extra mana and have it exile just a non-land permanent. Blot Out is a really cool card, 3 mana instant. Target opponent exiles a creature or planeswalker they control with the greatest mana value among creatures or planeswalkers they control. It's a reasonably clean answer to planeswalkers, because a lot of the time planeswalkers are the highest mana cost. It's also a reasonably clean answer to opposing Thruns, and it's just a decent card, especially to play at instant speed. Playing 3 Preacher of the Schisms. Playing this on turn 2, especially with Llanowar Elves, is so strong. It's a 2/4 with Death Touch. Whenever Preacher of the Schism attacks, the player with the most life or tied for the most life, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink, which you can sack the token to Fountain Port, by the way. And whenever Preacher of the Schism attacks while you have the most life or are tied for the most life, you draw a card and lose a life. What's kind of cool about Preacher of the Schism is that if you have the same life total as your opponent, both things happen, which is wild. We're also playing 3 Glissa Sunslayer, also insane to play on turn 2. It's a 3-mana 3/3 with First Strike and Death Touch. First Strike, Death Touch means that it wins every combat, which is wild, unless your opponent has also has first strike or indestructible or something. When it deals combat damage to a player, choose one. You draw a card, lose a life, destroy target enchantment, remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. There's a lot of stuff we can do with this, but as you can see, this card's a lot like Monster Dread Knight in that it is more than what it is on the surface and can pull us ahead as we 1-for-1 our opponents. We're playing 2 Maelstrom Pulse just as a catch-all removal. Also, if we're able to kill multiple creatures or permanents with the same Maelstrom Pulse, it's just gravy. 3 Shieldred. Shieldred is extremely powerful. Is a 4-mana 4/5 with Death Touch. Whenever you draw a card, gain 2 life. When your opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. This allows us to pull ahead in life total and is also a very scary threat on its own and very hard to answer. We're playing The End. Spells cost 2 less to cast if your life total is 5 or less. Hopefully that isn't happening. But we exile target creature or planeswalker, and then you get to extract that creature, which is a great catch-all removal and really good against decks that are playing cards like Monster Dread Knight or Shieldred or things like that you really want out of their deck and want to be able to exile. We're playing 2 Gix's Command. Now, Gix's Command is fine in the main deck because it's fine against the slower decks because you can bring creatures back and maybe make your opponent sacrifice creature or whatever. But really, it's in our deck for the red decks to be able to give something lifelink to wipe the board and really shut the door on these aggressive decks. We're playing 2 Thrun Breaker of Silence just as a very, very hard to answer creature, a very hard to block creature. It is all around like can kind of close the door on these mid-range decks like Green and Dimir. As far as the sideboard goes, we've already talked about Cut Down. We're playing Duress for these combo and control decks to be able to take out these non-creature spells. We've already talked about The End. Harvester of Misery has gone up pretty significantly in stock. It's very good against the aggressive decks, especially the Gruul and mono red decks, because it can just wipe the board, and is also early removal, so we're starting to play it as a 4 of rather than a 1 of. We're playing a single Terra Sunder. We've already talked about that to join the one in the main deck. We're playing 3 Tranquil Frillback. Tranquil Frillback is an interesting catch-all. We side it in against decks that have artifacts or enchantments that we dislike and aggressive decks so we can gain 4 life and just have a blocker. It's also fine as Graveyard Hate, so it's like really, really good all-around creature. And then we're playing 2 Nissa Ascended Animus, both as artifact and enchantment hate, and also it can close the door on these decks that are going very, very long with us. So this is blue-white control. As far as the lands go, we have some pretty exciting stuff going on. First off is Blast Zone. It is a colorless land that comes in untapped. XX and tap it to put X charge counters on Blast Zone, and it enters with a charge counter as well. And you can pay 3 mana and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So it's a land, produces mana, and it is a removal as well. Playing a single Demolition Field, which is a colorless untapped land as well. We can pay 2 mana and tap it to sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. That land's controller may search a library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. You may search a library for a basic land, put a card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. So great hate against other good lands, like Fountain Port. Fountain Port is, again, the colorless untapped land. You can pay 2 mana, sacrifice a token to draw a card. We can pay 3 mana to pay 1 life, create a 1/1 blue fresh creature token. And you can pay 4 mana and tap it to create a treasure token. So it combos with itself, but also there's some other tokens in this deck. And so it's a great mana dump. It can provide a little bit of a threat. It can provide a mana advantage, and it can provide massive card advantage in a land. Fountain Port is absolutely excellent. Restless Anchorage is our man land. Enters tapped. It produces our colors, and we pay 3 mana until end of turn. Restless Anchorage becomes a 2/3 white and blue bird creature with flying. It's still land. When it attacks, create a map token, which you can then sacrifice Fountain Port, which is pretty awesome. The overall strategy of this deck as a whole is to stop what your opponent's doing and then provide either a large threat or control everything as you slowly whittle down their life total with the fish or, with Beza or the Overlords, stuff like that. Which means this deck is kind of divided into 3 categories. It's card advantage, it's control, and then it's like threats. So to kind of talk about a bunch of the control cards, Get Lost is our big premium removal. It's a 2 mana instant, destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker's controller creates 2 map tokens. So it's a little bit of a downside, but it's reasonably unconditional, which is really nice. We're playing Change the Equation as a counter spell, 2 mana instant. Counter target spell of mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell of mana value 6 or less. Standard's pretty low to the ground right now, and so Change the Equation is pretty good against most decks and has targets against every deck. Playing 2 Negate, counter target non-creature spell for 2 mana. Non-creature spell is very, very powerful right now. It's important that you win the super long games that with the decks that are really good at grinding. And No More Lies is 2 mana instant, counter target spell unless controller pays 3. It's a mana leak effect. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So that's our counterspell suite and our instant speed removal suite. As far as some board wipes, we have Temporary Lockdown. Temporary Lockdown is the 3 mana enchantment. When it enters, exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until Temporary Lockdown leaves the battlefield. Very good against the super aggressive decks and pretty good against the self-bound decks as well. Stock Up is our primary card advantage. It isn't our only card advantage, but it's our primary one. It's a 3 mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. Put 2 of them into your hand and the rest at the bottom of your library in any order. 3 mana and it being a sorcery is kind of big, but having crazy card selection and 1 card replacing itself with 2 cards is literal advantage, and we get to select what cards we want. Stock Up is probably the best card advantage engine in Standard at the moment. We're also playing 3 Beza in the main deck and 1 in the board. Beza is an incredibly good controlling and mid-range card. It's a 4 mana 4/5. When it enters, create a treasure token. If an opponent controls more lands than you, gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2 1/1 Bluefish creature tokens if opponent controls more creatures than you. Draw a card if opponent has more cards in hand than you. So it's a great catch-up card. It's a great card that can stabilize the board kind of by itself, gain you a little bit of life, give you a little bit more time in life and blockers, draw some cards, whatever. And that's kind of the name of the game. We're playing 3 Day of Judgment, 4 mana destroy all creatures. This has additional board wipes. And we're playing 4 Jace Perfected Mind. This is another one of our card advantage engines. And it's a win condition as well. Actually, it fills both of those roles. It's a 4 mana planeswalker with 1 of the blue mana being Phyrexian mana, which means you can pay 2 life instead of that mana, and it'll enter with 2 less loyalty. We get +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0. Pretty good if your opponent has only 1 threat. It's a -2 as target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. So that's the card advantage here, and crazy card advantage as the game goes really long, which happens all the time. And it's -X as target player mills 3 times X cards, which very often after you've controlled the board, maybe they're answering your threats and stuff like that, you can just go 4 mana, mill 15 cards, and sometimes that can win you the game, especially after if you've gone through a Jace or 2 before and milled 3 cards here or there and had like a super long game. Sunfall is our last board wipe. It's 5 mana, not 4 mana. However, we exile all the creatures and we incubate X, so it can create a threat in and of itself, but 5 mana and 4 mana, that's a large jump. We're playing 4 Ride's End, which is a 5 mana instant that exile target creature or vehicle. However, it costs 3 less to cast if it targets a tap permanent. Very good against the aggressive decks, especially since exile removal is so important. Playing a single Horn-Locked Whale, which is on the adventure side, a 2 mana instant. Lagoon Breach. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on their choice of top or bottom of their library. So decent way to have temporary removal and then also buy you some time. And it is a 6 mana Flash Ward 2. Hornlock Whale enters tapped unless it's your turn. Pretty decent threat and pseudo removal in 1 card, and both are at instant speed, which we love. And then we're playing 2 Overlord of the Mistmoors. Overlord of the Mistmoors is a 7 mana Avatar. When it enters or attacks, create 2 2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying, and we can impend it for 4 mana. This is one of our major threats, the way we end the game. Very, very good against these mid-range decks and actually self-bounce decks as well. After we've stabilized, or if we need blockers, we just play Overlord of the Mistmoors and we can just win. As far as the sideboard goes, Devout Decree. It's a 2 mana sorcery, exile target creature or planeswalker that's black or red. Scry 1, decent against like the pixie decks, really good against the red decks. You know, like we kind of love this card. I love that it hits Kaido, which is really nice, and Scrying, so we can get some card selection is also important. Playing 2 Rest in Peace for that graveyard hate. We've already talked about Beza and Overlord and Negate, so we're kind of just like finishing out play sets and adding additional cards with our sideboard. What's cool is we have this card selection with Stock Up, so like that main deck kind of splitting up a bunch of cards that might be sideboard cards is actually totally fine. We're playing 3 Tishana's Tidebinder for those enter the battlefield effects, so 3 mana 2/3 with flash. When Tishana's Tidebinder enters, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. Which means it gives us a threat that's instant speed, also stops abilities from being triggered and things like that. Obstinate Bailoff and Whitleaf Liege kind of go into a similar category. And I realize Obstinate Baloth is green, but let me explain. Obstinate Baloth is a 4-mana 4/4. When it enters, you gain 4 life. If a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Obstinate Baloth, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. And then Wiltleaf Liege is another 4-mana 4/4. Green creatures get +1/+1, white creatures get +1/+1, and it has that discard ability as well. We're siding this in against the bounce decks because Hopeless Nightmare tears our deck apart. And if we have Obstinate Baloth and Wiltleaf Liege, Obstinate Baloth is a little bit better than Wiltleaf Liege if we can have the Hopeless Nightmare thing happen, because gaining 4 life is just so powerful. And so we side these in against those decks, essentially because we can just win the game if we have that in hand and they Hopeless Nightmare us. Cool additional thing about Wiltleaf Liege too is it pumps up all of our white creatures and the tokens from the insects and stuff like that as well. Then we're playing 2 Dissection Tools, a 5-mana artifact. When Dissection Tools enters, manifest Dread, then attach Dissection Tools to that creature. Equip your creature gets +2/+2 as Death Touch and Lifelink, and we can equip it by sacrificing a creature. This can kind of slam the door on aggressive decks and stuff like that. Death Touch and Lifelink is just so powerful. This is Dimir Bounce in Standard, and I wanted to tackle that last question first before we start talking about this deck. The Esper Bounce deck is the hotness of Standard right now, so why would you play the Dimir version? So there are 2 things that pop up into my head when I think about that question. First off, the Esper version deals a lot of damage to itself with Pain Lands, and so while the aggro matchup is leaning good, it can just lose by dealing 4 or 5 damage to itself and then not being able to keep up with the aggro. The Dimir version solves that issue. It really shores up the aggro matchup, makes the aggro matchup truly excellent rather than just good. The other reason is consistency. The white cards, while powerful, aren't really needed in this bounce archetype, and so you're giving up a little bit of power for being able to cast all your spells all the time and being a more focused version of the bounce deck. That being said, let's talk about this deck. As far as the lands go, it's just blue-black lands with some man lands and Wreath and Soulstone Sanctuary, just to be able to finish off our opponent if needed. We're playing for Spyglass Siren. Spyglass Siren is a 1/1 creature with flying. When it enters, create a map token. We like this because it is evasive, so it's good for Enduring Innocence and Kaido, and it does things when it enters, so it's fine for this town ain't big enough. We're playing for Storm Chaser's Talent, which is a class enchantment. When it enters, create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. We can trigger prowess really easily, so it's actually a pretty aggressive card. When we level it up, you return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and it's level 3 for 6 more mana is whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. This card is great because you can level it up and capitalize on returning this town ain't big enough or whatever, get that aggressive otter, and then be able to bounce it with either Fear of Isolation or this town ain't big enough to get more otters and be able to replay it for very cheap. We're playing 2 Cut Down as aggro hate. One black mana to destroy target creature with total power and toughness 5 or less. Pretty self-explanatory. We're playing 3 Hopeless Nightmare. When it enters, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. When Hopeless Nightmare is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, scry 2, which is fine. We can pay 3 mana to sacrifice Hopeless Nightmare. Really what we're doing with this is we're bouncing this over and over to tear apart our opponent's hand and also deal a lot of damage that's effectively burn damage. We're playing for Fear of Isolation, which is a 2-mana 2/3 with flying. As an additional cost to cast a spell, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. So this is one of our 2, I guess 3, Kaido's kind of a bounce enabler too. This is one of our 3 bounce enablers. It's also evasive, so very good for Enduring Curiosity. We're playing for Flood Pit's Drowner, which is a 2-mana 2/1 with Vigilance and Flash. When it enters, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And we can pay 2 mana and tap Flood Pit's Drowner to have target creature with a stun counter on it and Flood Pit's Drowner be shuffled into their owner's libraries. So this gets more blockers out of the way so we can keep capitalizing on Enduring Curiosity and Kaido. And it has that very powerful enter the battlefield effect, so returning it is pretty solid. And we can tap it and pay that 2 mana to permanently get rid of something. Playing Go for the Throat as unconditional removal. Playing 4 Nowhere to Run, which is a 2-mana enchantment. When Nowhere to Run enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-3 till end of turn. And then creatures your opponent control can be targets of spells and abilities, although they didn't have hexproof, and ward abilities of those creatures don't trigger. So this is our removal spell on the stick, being able to play Nowhere to Run, kill a creature, either play Fear of Isolation or this town ain't big enough to return Nowhere to Run, take out another creature. Very powerful. And now let's get to our real payoff cards. We're playing 3 Enduring Curiosity. Enduring Curiosity is a 4/3 with Flash. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. And when it dies, if it was a creature, return to the battlefield under its owner's control if it's an enchantment. And so we have all of these evasive creatures, and we hit our opponent with those evasive creatures. We get to draw cards, which is extremely powerful. Kaido is another one of our payoffs. It is a 4-mana planeswalker. However, it has an ninjutsu for 3, which means it can enter the battlefield for 3 mana by returning a creature that had not been blocked and it's tapped and attacking. And during your turn, as long as Kaido has 1 or more loyalty counters on him, he's a 3/4 ninja and has hexproof. Its +1 is you get an emblem with ninjas you control, get +1/+1. Its 0 is Surveil 2, then draw a card for each opponent who lost life this turn. And its -2 is tap target creature, put 2 stun counters on it. This gets things out of the way, is a very, very scary threat, and allows us to draw even more cards, and returns these creatures to our hands so that we can continue to get those enter the battlefield effects. And then we're playing 4 This Town Ain't Big Enough. This Town Ain't Big Enough is a 5-mana instant. However, it costs 3 less if it targets a permanent you control, and you can return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So effectively, it's 2 mana to return 2 of our permanents to our hands, or 2 mana to return like 1 of our permanents and get something out of the way of our opponents, or 5 mana to return 2 things of our opponents. This is a really, really big enabler. It allows us to keep bouncing our stuff and keep capitalizing on all of that stuff. And so we're playing these cards with enter the battlefield effects. We're dealing damage to our opponent with our evasiveness and drawing cards with enduring curiosity. And then we're returning stuff over and over with This Town Ain't Big Enough and Fear of Isolation to keep capitalizing on those enter the battlefield effects. As far as the sideboard goes, Negate is really solid to stop, our opponent's non-creature spells that are relevant. It's not really more to get into it. Get Out is pretty interesting. It's a 2-mana instant. Town target creature and enchantment spell, or return 1 or 2 target creature and enchantments you own to your hand. So really good if we want to return something to our hand, but also really decent when there are creatures and especially enchantments that we want to make sure we have counter magic for. We're playing 2 Shoshana's Tidebinder to deal with cards like Temporary Lockdown, which end up being pretty good against us. Cut down 3 and 4 against the aggro decks. Duress against things with non-creature spells that we care about. Preacher of the Schism and Shieldred are in a similar category. Sometimes the bounce version of our deck isn't very good, and we have to side out a lot of cards because they're not good. Like, there's a lot of decks that like No Order Run's bad against and Cut Down's bad against and all that stuff. And so Shieldred and Preacher of the Schism allows us to lean a little bit heavier into the mid-range version of the deck. And then Gis's Command is mostly for the aggro decks, being able to kill creatures and give big creatures lifelink and all that stuff. So this is Jeskai Convoke. What this deck is essentially attempting to do is play a bunch of cheap creatures that you can either capitalize on or make artifacts, so you can Gleeful Demolition them to be able to get a bunch of creatures very, very early in the game, to then use Warden of the Inner Sky to get really, really big and apply a ton of pressure and be able to select your draws, to be able to play Knight Errant of Eos to be able to dig through your deck, and to be able to play Imitating's Recruiter to attack for a ton. It's all about getting a ton of small creatures and then using those 3 cards to be able to just capitalize on that. The lands, there's not much to look at. They're just a bunch of lands that enter untapped in the first few turns because those are the turns that matter. But let's start with Novice Inspector. It's a 1/2 for 1 when it enters Investigate, which means create a clue token. Now, sometimes we're popping this clue token. Sometimes we're just using it as an artifact for Gleeful Demolition. Spyglass Siren, I'm skipping over Warden on purpose. Spyglass Siren is a 1-mana 1/1 with flying. When it enters, create a map token. Again, for a similar reason, we're playing Novice Inspector. It creates an artifact, which we can then Gleeful Demolition. Clockwork Percussionist is a 1-mana 1/1 with haste. When it dies, exile the top card of your library. You may play it till end of your next turn. So this allows us to dig through our deck, but also it's an artifact in and of itself. Again, for you guessed it, Gleeful Demolition. Gleeful Demolition says destroy target artifact. If you controlled that artifact, create 3 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. All of these cards allow us to play a bunch of creatures for really cheap, and sometimes 3 creatures for 1, being able to destroy one of the artifacts that are made with Novice Inspector, Spyglass Siren, or Clockwork Percussionist itself. The other card we're using to sort of flood the board is Resolute Reinforcements, which is a 2-mana 1/1 with flash, which is kind of interesting. It actually works really well with Protect the Negotiators in the sideboard and other instant speed things that we could be doing. But when it enters, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So this just allows us to create 2 creatures for 1 card. It's 2 mana, so meh, but also it creates 2 creatures for 1 card, which is excellent. So between all of these cards, we're putting a ton of creatures on the board. So we capitalize on that by playing Warden of the Inner Sky, which is a 1-mana 1/2. When it has 3 or more counters on it, it has Flying and Vigilance, which is cool. So how do we get counters on it? Well, you can tap 3 artifacts and or creatures you control, put a +1/+1 counter on Warden of the Inner Sky, and scry 1 activate only as a sorcery. So what's cool about Warden of the Inner Sky is you can tap itself for it, but also you can tap the clue with Novice Inspector. You can tap the map with Spyglass Siren. You can tap all these tokens on Gleeful Demolition, etc., to make Warden of the Inner Sky very big and scry one a whole bunch of times so you can sort of control the top card of your deck. And notice it has Vigilance when it has 3 or more +1/+1 counters. So it's a really good blocker and attacker. What's relevant about that as well is notice that clues don't require tapping to sacrifice it and draw a card. So there are times that you can tap the clue to pump up Warden of the Inner Sky and then still draw a card off the clue. That comes up quite a bit. Another way that we sort of capitalize on this is Imidane's Recruiter. Imidane's Recruiter has an adventure called Train Troops, which is pretty solid, creating 2 white knight creature tokens with Vigilance. If we're casting this, that means things have gone a little wrong, but I've won games by casting this, so don't worry about it. But Imidane's Recruiter is a 3 mana 2/2. When it enters, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. So after we have a bunch of these creatures, we play an Imidane's Recruiter. Everything is +1/+0, and we jam often for game. We're also playing Knight Errant of Eos. It is a 5 mana 4/4 with Convoke. Convoke meaning I can tap creatures and pay for mana of that creature's color, or generic mana. When it enters, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal up to 2 creature cards with mana value X or less from among them, where X is the number of creatures that convoke Knight Errant of Eos. Put the reveal cards in your hand and then shuffle. So especially because a lot of cards in our deck are not very powerful in and of themselves, it's really important we're able to dig through our deck either with the Scries with Warden or digging through with Knight Errant of Eos in order to capitalize on these really cheap creatures with these 3 payoff creatures, and Knight Errant of Eos does that really well. Also, being a 4/4 body for effectively 0 mana very often is super relevant. Often a very powerful start and a very common start is play Novice Inspector or Spyglass Siren on turn 1, Gleeful Demolitioning that artifact on turn 2 and playing another 1-drop, and in the same turn on turn 2 playing Knight Errant of Eos, putting 2 cards in your hand, and you have an insane amount of power, and then you can follow it up with like an Imidane's Recruiter or something. Now we do have some non-creatures joining the party, mostly as removal, so we can get things out of the way and jam a whole bunch. We have Case of the Gateway Express. It is a 2 mana case. When it enters, choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. What's beautiful about that is that often we have a lot of creatures, so often this just gets rid of a creature. Also, the case gets solved when you attack with 3 or more creatures, and then once it's solved, creatures you control get +1/+0, which is another anthem and a way to pump up these creatures and make these really cheap, kind of poopy creatures very good. We're also playing 4 Sheltered by Ghosts, again as removal. It is a 2 mana aura. We enchant a creature you control, and when it enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghosts leaves the battlefield. And the enchanted creature gets +1/+0, has lifelink and ward 2. So main deck hate for these aggressive decks, already very good in this format. The red-based decks are insane, but also it gets things out of the way so that we can jam. It allows us to race other aggressive decks and pumps up the creature it's on, which is relevant, especially if it's like an evasive creature or something, or a big creature like Knight Errant. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 2 Destroy Evil, both as enchantment hate and as like Shieldred hate and stuff. We're playing 1 Split Up. Split Up is really good in the mirror match, especially after they convoke for a whole bunch, or really against these aggressive decks that are going to be attacking and we're kind of racing against. Any deck that we race against, we want to be siding Split Up. Playing 2 Disdainful Stroke for these big mana decks like Domain. 2 Protect the Negotiators, mostly for slower decks that have cards that are a really big deal, like Sunfall or Split Up or Temporary Lockdown, that we need to be countering or we just lose. Playing a Lithomantic Barrage, mostly for the Dimir deck. Being able to take out those creatures for 1 mana is super relevant. And then we're playing 4 Torch the Tower, mostly for these aggressive decks, also really good against Mosso Dread Knight, and there's a lot of applications for Torch the Tower here, especially since we often have the artifact to be able to sacrifice to bargain, which is not true for a lot of Torch the Tower decks. So this is the Omniscience combo deck in Standard. Essentially, I'll explain the combo and then talk about these supporting cards. These are all definitely just like supporting cards, trying to draw into the combo. Essentially, what you're trying to do is put Omniscience into the graveyard and then reanimate that Omniscience with Abdullo's Awakening. And it's a 1/1 spirit in addition to its other types, but it's still an Omniscience, so everything is free now. We get Omniscience into our graveyard with basically every card we have. Picklock Prankster, Moment of Truth, The Archaeologist, Chart a Course, Confounding Riddle, Ifara's Dispersal, all put cards in your graveyard. And also let us select Abdullo's Awakening and Invasion of Arcavios. We're then going to spend all of our free spells to hit the invasion, play the invasion, For free, remember, to grab Season of Weaving, we then choose an artifact or creature you control, create a token that's a copy of it, and return each non-land, non-token permanent to its owner's hand. So we decide to copy the 1/1 Omniscience to create another 1/1, this time it's a token, and then everything returns to our hand as even Invasion of Archaeavos. We can replay the Omniscience if we want to, but then we just replay that Invasion, grab Season of Weaving this time from our graveyard, because it was when it enters, search your library, graveyard, and or outside the game for an instant or sorcery card you own, reveal it, put into your hand. If you search your library, so we shuffle. To grab Season of Weaving again, do the same thing, and now we have 2 1/1s, and Invasion is back to our hand. We cast Invasion, Season Weaving again, now we have 3 1/1s, etc., etc., etc. This also gets blockers out of the way, and all of that stuff as well. Now, once we have enough 1/1s to defeat our opponent the following turn, we continue digging until we have multiple invasions. By the way, you can keep replaying Archaeologists over and over too, if you just like play it, dig, whatever. So it's actually pretty easy to get to the Invasion of Archaeavos. But once we have multiple, and we have enough of these 1/1 Omniscience tokens, with the first invasion, we then grab a negate. Second invasion, we do the cycle. Both of the invasions are back in our hand. First invasion, we grab the second negate. Second invasion, we cycle. And we get whatever else we need out of either our deck, either through counter magic or out of our sideboard, fill our hand with a bunch of counter magic and crazy stuff to stop our opponent from dealing with the million, essentially infinite 1/1s that we get past the turn. Opponent can't do anything because we have effectively infinite negates. Our opponent's forced to pass back, and then we win. So that is essentially the combo. The supporting cards in the lands, we have Meticulous Archive. It's really sweet when we get to just Surveil on Omniscience. Same thing with Conduit Pylons. And then the rest of these cards sometimes do something as well, but mostly we're trying to put this Omniscience into our graveyard and to dig for Abdullah's Awakening. Chart, of course, we draw 2 cards and discard a card. We're able to discard Omniscience and dig. Philagi Archaeologist. When it enters, we mill 3 cards, then put a non-creature, non-land card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, it gets +1/+1. So it's actually a decent blocker, returns with Season of Weaving, and gets Omniscience in our graveyard. Moment of Truth is instant. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of these cards into your hand, 1 into your graveyard, and 1 in the bottom of your library. Again, grabs Abdullah's Awakening, puts Omniscience into our graveyard. Picklock Prankster, we're playing for free the Fae. Mill 4 cards, then put an instant sorcery card or fairy card from among the milled cards into your hand. Put Omniscience in the graveyard. Abdullah's Awakening is a sorcery. Perfect. Confounding Riddle is an instant. We can either counter target spell unless the controller pays 4, so decent counter magic. And look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the rest into your graveyard. And no explanation needed. And a Fire's Dispersal. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Costs 2 less to the target's an attacking creature, and we Surveil 2. So again, this allows us that card selection, allows us to put Omniscience in our graveyard, and it's able to buy us time, which is often the name of the game. And all of that to dig for this combo, Omniscience in the graveyard, Abdullah's Awakening in our hand, and then be able to just cast Invasion, which, by the way, once we do this, we can just cast all of this stuff for free to dig for an Invasion to start the combo and win the game. And then as far as the sideboard goes, we have Exercise for enchantment and artifact removal. I'm thinking like Rest in Peace is pretty good against us. Get Lost for similar things, but also gets rid of problematically sized creatures. Grand Abolishers, a 2-mana 2/2. During your turn, your opponent can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifact creatures or enchantments. If we're afraid of instant speed interruption, especially counter magic, this card is excellent. Temporary Lockdown for these aggressive decks. Exile each non-land permanent mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. Minor Misstep, also pretty decent against these aggressive decks. Counter target spell with mana value 1 or less. Negate, we've already talked about. But remember, Invasion of Archaeavos, I can never say it, allows us to grab stuff from our library too, so it's totally fine to side in. But it's really to kind of lock things down. Unnerving Grafts, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Manifest Dread, it puts something in the graveyard and also deals with problematic permanents. Again, Rest in Peace immediately pops into my head the turn we want a combo. And then Season of Weaving, again, is that combo piece we grab with Invasion. That stays in, stays out of play. So this is the Selesnya Cage deck. Effectively, this is a green-white aggro deck that capitalizes on Collector's Cage because we're putting +1/+1 encounters on stuff anyway. Now, the mana base is straightforward. It's just green and white lands, even the green-white man land, and we're playing a single Mirex just for a little bit of additional aggression. But let's talk about the combo in the deck first. It's Collector's Cage. Collector's Cage is a pretty disgusting artifact. It's 2 mana, it has Hideaway 5. So basically you look at the top 5 cards of your library and you put 1 face down underneath Collector's Cage. And then you can pay 1 mana and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So this is obviously insane if we get an Overlord of the Mistmoors or a Whitley Fleege underneath it, or really even like any of these 3 mana spells underneath it. Also notice this can end up being a combat trick as well, because it's only 1 mana to do it, and you can do it as much as you want, even if the thing is no longer underneath it. And so making our creatures bigger in that way is just absolutely great. That being said, let's talk about these cards that we really want to be comboing with. Overlord of the Mistmoors is a 6/6 with impending 4 for 4 mana, and when it enters or attacks, create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. This is just the end of the game for a lot of decks. A lot of decks can't answer 3 giant things at once, especially as early as turn 3 with Collector's Cage is just really, really good. And then Whitley Fleege is really solid. Is a 4 mana. Other green creatures you control get +1/+1. Other white creatures you control get +1/+1. Which, by the way, that means these dual colored cards like Malira and Seraphic Steed get +2/+2 because they're green and white. And if a spell or ability on opponent controls causes you to discard this card, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it in your graveyard, which is really good against the Esper and Dimir bounce decks. Because they're looking to have you discard. So it's really our combo, but Collector's Cage is good with just really anything in our deck. We're going to be using these alongside Mana Ramp in Llanowar Elves. It allows us to attack and then also be able to get out our creatures much, much faster, like in any green-white aggro deck. Pawpatch Recruit is an excellent 2/1 for 1. However, it has Offspring 2, which you create a 1/1 copy of it. Has Trample, and whenever a creature you control becomes a target spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. So this allows you to have even more +1/+1 counters, spread out that power and toughness even more so that we can have Collector's Cage happen, and it's just a really aggressive creature as well. We're playing 2 Malira Living Cure. It's a 3/3 for 2, which is just like really powerfully costed. If you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. So that's good against the weird poison decks, but that's not really why we're playing it. But we can exile Malira Living Cure to choose another target creature or artifact. When it's put into the graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So this is really good at like protecting ourselves against removal spells. If we have a Malira and an Overlord, they can't answer the Overlord if we have a Malira, because then we're just going to get the trigger again, which is just really, really disgusting. So it's a very aggressive card and also protects our big payoffs over here. Playing 2 Seraphic Steed. It's a 2/2 for 2 with first strike and lifelink, very good against the aggressive decks. And whenever Seraphic Steed attacks while saddled, create a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying and has saddle 4. So saddling it is a little bit difficult, but it can become like create a creature on a stick for no mana, and having first strike means that after a +1/+1 counter or 2 from like Collector's Cage or Pawpatch Recruit or whatever, it becomes pretty difficult to block. We're also playing 4 Sandstorm Salvager. It's a 3 mana 1/1. When it enters, create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. So it's a little reminiscent of like Blade Splicer. And you pay 2 mana and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature token you control. They gain trample until end of turn. So that's really solid because you can put a +1/+1 counter on the golem, obviously, on the flyers you get from Overlord, on the offspring from Pawpatch Recruit, on the angels from Seraphic Steed, on the bats from Sanguine Evangelist, on the 4/4 from Toby. That does it really, really well. So your creatures get really big pretty fast. Speaking of Toby, there's a 3 mana 1/1 where when it enters, you get a 4/4 white beast creature token. With this creature can't attack or block alone. Don't worry, little guy. We're going to be attacking with everyone. And as long as you control 4 or more creature tokens you control have flying. So Toby can just be a really interesting card that can just like launch all of your creature tokens, which is really fun. And then we have 4 Sanguine Evangelists, which is a 2/1 with Battle Cry. Battle Cry is when you attack, all your attacking creatures get +1/+0. And when Sanguine Evangelist enters or dies, create a 1/1 bat black creature token with flying. So notice we're going very, very wide. We're ramping our mana. We have a little combo in Collector's Cage, and we're putting a ton of +1/+1 counters on our creatures. As far as supporting instances of sorceries, we're playing 2 Sheltered by Ghosts. It's a 2 mana aura where when it enters, exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghost leaves the battlefield. An enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has lifelink and ward 2. Very, very good against the aggressive decks. And they're playing 3 Parting Gusts, which is a 2 mana instant, gift to tap fish. Exile target non-token creature. If the gift wasn't promised, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is really good to get things out of the way, sure, but we can just not promise a gift to exile exile one of these creatures that has an enter the battlefield effect, like Overlord of the Mistmoors, like Sanguine Evangelist, like Toby, or whatever, which is not only a way to protect our creatures, but also a way to get the end of the battlefield trigger again, which is really solid. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, Elspeth's Might is very good against these really aggressive decks. Destroy Evil, good against things with big butted blockers like Shieldred or Preacher of the Schism, and good against enchantments. Invasion of Gobakhan is a hand hate. Notice like board wipes are really good against these Selesnya aggro decks, so that's really good. 2 more Shelter by Ghosts for these aggressive decks. Aven Interrupter for decks that spend a lot of mana on spells that are very impactful. So yes, board wipes are included, which we do with Invasion of Gobakhan, but also against decks that we could counter and be mana positive with the Aven Interrupter. Playing 2 Split Up. I don't know why there's not a number there, but this one-sided board wipe against other creature decks. And we could go up to 4 Wiltleaf Liege for these decks that are making us discard. It's also just like a decent card to bring in and a powerful card to bring in if we have too many cards we need to bring out against a certain deck. So it's the black-white bounce deck. Essentially, it's just a black-white mid-range deck that's playing Nurturing Pixie and a bunch of cards that they can return to their hand to get a little bit more value out of. That's honestly the long and short of it. As far as the lands go, it's just black-white lands, playing a few man lands and Restless Fortress, being a Orzhov land that you can pay 4 mana for to have it become a 1/4 white and black nightmare creature until end of turn, having it still a land. And when it attacks, defending player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And Soulstone Sanctuary, which comes in untapped and is a colorless land. You can pay 4 mana to have this land become a 3/3 creature with vigilance and all creature types, and it's still a land. Notably, not until end of turn it stays a creature. Other than that, it's just straight up black-white lands. Mana's pretty good in this deck. This deck is centered around this card, Nurturing Pixie. Nurturing Pixie is a 1/1 with flying for 1 mana. When it enters, return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If a permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. So essentially, this is a 2/2 for 1, where you can return all these other permanents that have awesome enter the battlefield effects and essentially reset them. For example, Grimbauble. Grimbauble is a 1 mana artifact. When it enters, target creature an opponent controls get -2/-2 until end of turn, and we can pay 3 mana, tap it, and sacrifice it to Surveil 2. So it is a great removal spell, and then also filters our draws, and it can be returned with Nurturing Pixie. Playing 4 Hopeless Nightmare, it's a 1 mana enchantment. When it enters, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life, and when Hopeless Nightmare is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, scry 2. This allows you to attack their hand, and again can be recurred with Nurturing Pixie. We're playing a Tiny Bones Joins Up. It's a legendary enchantment. When it enters, any number of target players each discard a card, and whenever a legendary creature you control enters, any number of target players each mill a card and lose 1 life. That part doesn't really matter. However, it's kind of just Hopeless Nightmare number 5. Hashtag mathematically perfect. We're playing 4 Get Lost. Get Lost is just our pretty unconditional removal, destroying a creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. Its controller creates 2 map tokens. The map tokens don't really matter. It's just having that removal is super important. We're playing 4 Momentum Breaker. It's a 2 mana enchantment with Start Your Engines. And whenever it enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature or a vehicle of their choice. Each opponent who can't discards a card. And you can pay 2 mana to sacrifice the enchantment to gain life equal to your speed. So it can attack their hand, but also it's just like another removal that can be recurred with Nurturing Pixie. We are playing a Nowhere to Run. Kind of like Grimbauble, it's a removal that can be recurred with Nurturing Pixie. It's a 2 mana with Flash. When it enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-3 till end of turn. And creatures your opponent control can't be the target of spells or abilities as though they didn't have hexproof. Ward abilities of those creatures don't trigger, which is sometimes relevant, but a little less relevant than just the -3/-3 that can be recurred. Playing 2 Lauren of the Third Path, 3 mana, 2/1 with Vigilance. When Lauren of the Third Path enters, destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment, and you and each opponent each draw a card if you tap it. Again, that is another thing that can be recurred. That is just a great artifact and enchantment hate. We're playing 4 Temporary Lockdown. It is a 3 mana enchantment. When Temporary Lockdown enters, exile each non-land permanent mana value 2 or less until Temporary Lockdown leaves the battlefield. Great against the aggressive decks, but also there's a little bit of a combo here where everything costs very little, and you can Temporary Lockdown a bunch of stuff away, and then lure in your Temporary Lockdown to get these end of the battlefield effects again, which is really cute. Playing 3 Liliana the Veil. It's a 3 mana planeswalker starting at 3 loyalty. Its +1 is each player discards a card. Its -2 is target player sacrifices a creature. And the ultimate, which is -6, is separate all permanents target player controls into 2 piles. That player sacrifice all permanents in the pile of their choice. Yet another way to attack the hand alongside these other cards. And more sacrifice removal, which is very powerful. And then we're playing 4 Unholy Annex. Unholy Annex is another one of these rooms. On one side is a 3 mana. At the beginning of your end step, draw a card. If you control a demon, each opponent loses 2 life. You gain 2 life. Otherwise, you lose 2 life. We don't have any normal demons in our deck, but the other side, Ritual Chamber, is 5 mana. When you unlock this door, create a 6/6 black demon creature token with flying. This gives us that card advantage and additional pressure. Really, it's just a mid-range deck with some really cool combos and really hard to play against because you're discarding a lot of cards when you play against this deck. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing Rest in Peace. When it enters, exile all graveyards. And if a card or token we put into the graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. It's just our graveyard hate. We've already talked about Lauren. It's just artifact enchantment hate, just Lauren 3 and 4. Playing 3 Enduring Innocence. Enduring Innocence is a 3 mana 2/1 with lifelink. And whenever one or more creatures you control with power 2 or less enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. When Enduring Innocence dies, if it was a creature, return to the battlefield under owner's control. It's an enchantment. Big reason we'd play Enduring Innocence is if we're playing against a deck that is looking to outcard us and we feel like we need to draw more cards. So these super, super long games, we can cast Enduring Innocence and then draw cards off of our Nurturing Pixie and Lauren and even Beza and Tiny Bones out of our sideboard. Playing 2 Beza, the Bounding Spring. This is a 4 mana 4/5. When it enters, create a treasure token. If opponent has more lands than you, gain 4 life. If opponent has more life than you, create 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens. If opponent controls more creatures than you, and draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. Great against these mid-range decks, great way to catch up against aggro decks, and great way to draw more cards against like control decks and continue with our outcard our opponent's plan. We're playing 3 Cut Down, 1 mana instant, destroy target creature with total power and toughness 5 or less. This is mostly our answer to these aggressive decks. And then we're playing a single Tiny Bones. The Pickpocket is a 1 mana 1/1 with Death Touch, so great blocker first off. And whenever Tiny Bones Pickpocket deals damage to a player, you may cast target non-land permanent card from that player's graveyard, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. This is really good against decks that we again really need to outcard. Because casting our opponent's cards is pretty powerful. Very often, these Tiny Bones and Enduring Innocence sort of come in together because, they combo off of each other just a little bit. So this is Azorius Tempo. What this deck is attempting to do is fill their graveyard with instants and sorceries as fast as possible with cards like Moment of Truth, Chart a Course, Found in the Third Path, Picklock Prankster, to fill their hand with interaction like Unsummon and Soul Partition or Split Up and Negate, and have a giant Haughty Djinn, be able to cast Aberranoculus and it just be a threat in and of itself, or cheat Aberranoculus onto the battlefield with Helping Hand and Recommission. Now, as far as the mana base goes, the only weird thing that I want to draw your attention to is we're playing an extra Surveil land in Undercity Sewers. Just a blue, it's basically like a blue Surveil land, because Surveilling is extra good in this deck because, again, we're trying to fill our graveyard as fast as possible so we can cast Aberranoculus, maybe get Aberranoculus into the graveyard so we can reanimate it, and to have a giant Haughty Djinn. That's kind of the whole point of this deck. Other than that, it's just blue-white lands that come in untapped. We're playing 4 Helping Hand. Helping Hand is 1 mana, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield, tapped. The cool part about this card is, yeah, we have kind of a scam hand with Aberranoculus or whatever, but also we only have 8 actual threats. Picklock Prankster is only kind of a threat. We only have 8 actual threats in Haughty Djinn and Aberranoculus. And so when our opponent answers those threats, we can Helping Hand to just bring back those threats. So really we have 12, 15 threats with Recommission as well. We're playing 2 Unsummon, return target creature to his owner's hand. This is great to protect our very few threats, but also to get other flyers out of the way or scary stuff out of the way. We're playing 3 Recommission. Recommission is 2 mana, return target artifact or creature card, mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If a creature card enters this way, it enters with additional +1/+1 counter on it. So 1 more mana for a slightly better effect than Helping Hand to reanimate Aberranoculus and Haughty Djinn from the graveyard after we mill them. Playing 3 Soul Partition as a pretty unconditional removal. It is a 2 mana instant, exile target non-land permanent. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it. A spell cast by opponent this way costs 2 more to cast. This is just for problematic permanents, things like Rest in Peace, flyers to get out of the way. Remember, we're a tempo deck, so really we're just trying to make our opponents spend way more mana than we are. We're playing 4 Chart a Course. Chart a Course says 2 mana sorcery, draw 2 cards, and discard a card unless you attack this turn. We don't mind discarding a card because we can reanimate stuff. We want instant sorceries in our graveyard to make Haughty Giant, and all that stuff. And also we're able to kind of filter the cards in our hand. We're playing Founding of the Third Path. It is a 2-mana saga where its first chapter has read ahead. And its first chapter is you may cast an instant sorcery spell with mana value 1 or 2 from your hand without paying its mana cost. So that's kind of an interesting one. Its second chapter is target player mills 4 cards. We obviously want to target ourselves with that. And its third chapter is exile target instant sorcery spell from your graveyard, copy it. You may cast that copy. And remember this, you have to cast it. So you do have to spend the mana on the third chapter. But that's just like very powerful, being able to reuse these instant sorcery cards we put in our graveyard, be able to fill our graveyard and cast spells, which is kind of what this deck is attempting to do. We're playing 4 Moment of Truth. Moment of Truth is a 2-mana instant. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand, 1 in your graveyard, and 1 at the bottom of your library. So we fill our graveyard and we get that decent card selection at instant speed. We're playing a 1 of Negate to deal with non-creature spells. We're playing 4 Picklock Prankster. Picklock Prankster being a 1/3 with vigilance and flying, but on its adventure side, it's mill 4 cards and put an instant sorcery card or fairy card, so it can pick itself if you mill it, from among the mill cards and put them into your hand. So again, we're milling, we're getting that card selection of instant sorceries so that we can kind of select what we want to do. Picklock Prankster is exactly what we want. Also, it applies a little bit of pressure on its front side and is a decent mana dump to just be able to cast the creature. We're playing a 1 of Split Up. The interesting part about this is we don't have a lot of creatures and we can reanimate our creatures, and it's really easy to get our creatures to be tapped or untapped, whichever we want it to be, because our creatures are evasive. So Split Up can often be just a one-sided board wipe, but we can play in the main deck. We're playing 4 Abernoculus. Abernoculus, 3 mana, 5/5 with flying. As an additional cost to cast a spell, exile 6 cards from your graveyard, where that's pretty easy for this deck because we're filling our graveyard so much already. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Manifest Dread, which allows us to both fill our graveyard and provide additional threats, especially if we're able to nab another Abernoculus or a Haughty Djinn underneath that Manifest Dread, because then we can just pay the mana and turn it upright and it just be ridiculous. And then lastly, we're playing 4 Haughty Djinn. Haughty Djinn is a 3 mana star 4 with flying, and its power is equal to the number of instant sorcery cards in your graveyard, and it makes instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. That's exactly what the deck wants, right? We're filling our graveyard anyway, so we can have an absolutely massive Haughty Djinn, and it allows us to cast all of these 2 mana instant sorceries for 1 less mana, which is great. So again, the name of the game: fill our graveyard, apply this threat, protect that threat. And that's the kind of the tempo deck, right? We're casting everything super cheap. We're trying to kill our opponent in kind of one fell swoop or in just a few fell swoops. As far as the sideboard goes, Elspeth's Smite is excellent against the aggressive decks, just 1 mana interaction against attacking creatures. Destroy Evil is great for enchantments, also decent against like Shieldred, which is pretty good against us. Exercise, dealing our artifact, enchantment, and creature with power 4 or greater hate, very much our domain hate. Monastery Mentor is a fun card because it's 3 mana 2/2 with prowess, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess. This is really good against decks that just have a lot of removal and have a lot of interaction with us, and we feel like we need more threats, especially if we pair this with being able to cast an instant sorcery spell like immediately. It can be really overwhelming and becomes just another must answer creature in the deck. I'm playing 2 Temporary Lockdown for these aggressive decks. Negate, very good against obviously decks that play non-creature spells that we care about, and Ghost Vacuum is our graveyard hate. So this is the Golgari Graveyard deck by Zevin Faust. Look great on camera, like at any point. But essentially what you're attempting to do is put as many creatures in the graveyard as possible, and then you're playing a ton of payoffs that reward you for putting all of those creatures into the graveyard. That's the long and short of it. As far as the lands go, there's nothing special going on. You're playing the Golgari lands and whatnot. We're playing 4 Molt Tender. Molt Tender is a 1 mana 1/1. We can tap it to mill a card, which is great. We want to be filling our graveyard. And we can also tap it to exile a card from your graveyard to add 1 mana of any color. So while it's requires us to have cards in our graveyard in order for it to be a mana dork, it's very easy for this deck to do. So it's a mana dork that also puts additional cards into our graveyard. C-Note Scout is a 1-mana 1/1. However, when it enters, it explores, where you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it into your hand. If it's a non-land, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sea Scout, and you may put it in your graveyard. Great for filling up our graveyard or even digging and drawing. We're playing for 9 Vermin. When it enters, target player mills 2 cards, so it allows us to continue to fill our graveyard. And when it dies, target creature you don't control gets -1/-1 till end of turn. Very good against the aggressive decks and just is a decent blocker. This brings us to a bunch of our payoffs. So we're going to start with Souls of the Lost. Souls of the Lost is a 2-mana star +1. As additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card or sacrifice a permanent, which is fine. We want to be filling our graveyard anyway, and frankly, there's a lot of cards in our deck that just don't do anything when you're not in a certain situations. And Souls of the Lost power is equal to the number of permanent cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Nearly every card in our deck is a permanent card, and literally every card in our deck, in the main deck, is a permanent card, besides Overwhelming Remorse. So Souls of the Lost gets very, 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 very big, very, 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 very quickly. It's a great blocker and can finish out games very quickly. We're also playing 2 Up the Beanstalk. Up the Beanstalk, 2-mana enchantment. When it enters, and whenever you cast a spell, mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. This can give you massive mana advantage and just be an engine in your deck, because even though all of these cards, besides Harvester of Misery, can be cast for less than 5 mana, they're all considered 5 mana. So whether we are playing Overlord of the Balemurk for its impending, Overwhelming Remorse for 1 mana, Chitin Gravestalker for 1 mana, Hollow Marauder for 1 mana, Husband's Forge for 1 mana. All of them trigger Up the Beanstalk, and so it can really allow us to leverage our deck in a way that we can pull way, 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 way ahead. Speaking of all of these cards as well, really the only card that doesn't fall into this category, like I said, is Harvester of Misery. It's a 5-mana 5/4 with Menace. When Harvester of Misery enters, other creatures get -2/-2 till end of turn. Very good against the aggressive and the go-wide decks. However, we can discard it and pay 2 mana to have target creature get -2/-2 till end of turn. This is a way to put a permanent into the graveyard and by and large a creature into the graveyard while still having a removal spell, which is pretty sweet. And Overlord of the Balemurk is sort of in between being a payoff and not. It's a 5-mana 5/5. Whenever it enters or attacks, mill 4 cards, and then you may return a non-avatar creature card or a planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. So it can't like return itself. And it has impending 5 for 2 mana. So you can just cast it for 2 mana, trigger that Up the Beanstalk, be able to fill your graveyard, and then select one of these payoffs to be able to put into your hand. We're also playing Overwhelming Remorse. It's a 5-mana instant to exile target creature or planeswalker. Exile removal is so good in standard at the moment. And this spell costs 1 last for each creature card in your graveyard. We are filling our graveyard anyway, so very often this is 1 mana. We're playing 2 Chitin Gravestalker. 1 last to cast for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard. Has cycling 2, so if we need to dig, we can just like put that creature in our graveyard and it discounts everything else. But as long as we have 5 creatures in our graveyard, which is very easy to do, this is a 1-mana 5/4. Hollow Marauder has that same text, however, it has flying, and when it enters any number of target opponents, each discard a card. For each of those opponents who didn't discard a card with mana value 4 or greater, draw a card. And it's 4/2. For effectively 1 mana very often. This essentially says against everything but Domain, you get to draw a card and your opponent discards a card, because there's not a lot of cards that are being played that are mana value 4 or greater. And specifically against Domain, it is very, very powerful because you want to be tearing apart their hand, though be afraid of Obstinate Baloth. And they're playing Husband's Swarm. As long as we have 7 or more creature cards in our graveyard, this is a 1-mana 6/6 menace Death Touch. By the way, this also cares about being in exile as well, which is pretty solid. So we're trying to fill our graveyard with as many permanents and creatures as possible, and then play these payoffs and all these undercosted things and trigger out the Beanstalk a whole bunch of times. It is such a cool take on the graveyard deck. Or as far as the sideboard goes, we have some instances of sorceries. Got to be careful about siding those in because they do not work with our game plan. But we're playing Cut Down for these aggressive decks, Duress for things like Domain or Control or whatever. Starving Revenant is a 4-mana 4/4. When it enters, Surveil 2, then for each card you put on top of your library, you draw a card and lose 3 life. We have Descend 8. Whenever you draw a card, if there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. It's very good against decks that are going to go really, really long, allows you to dig. And we can get that Descend super, super, super easy. We're playing Terror Tide, 4-mana sorcery. All creatures get -X/-X till end of turn, where X the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. Really good against the go wide decks, or really just, I mean, this just like kills everything on the battlefield very easily because we have permanent cards in our graveyard all the time. Playing an extra Harvester of Misery in our sideboard for these aggressive decks. We're playing 4 Scrap Shooter. It's a 3-mana 4/4 with reach, and when it enters, if a gift was promised, destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. Great artifact enchantment hate. Also a 3-mana 4/4 is a decent blocker as well. Obstinate Baloth is a 4-mana 4/4. When it enters, you gain 4 life, and then if your opponent makes you discard it, you get to put it on the battlefield instead of your graveyard. Very, very good against the Pixie decks because of Hopeless Nightmare. Also decent against the aggressive decks, so you gain life and it's a blocker. And we're playing Haywire Might. It's a 1-mana 1/1. When it dies, you gain 2 life, and you can pay a green and sacrifice Haywire Might to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. Again, great artifact and enchantment hate. We need this, by the way, the Scrap Shooter and Haywire Might, for things like Rest in Peace and stuff like that, because that's real bad for us. And it gains life, which is pretty relevant. But this is Zevin Faust's graveyard deck that he top 8'd Pro Tour Aether Drift with. Is so impressive. It is such a sweet deck. We'll see if it's good. We'll see if the meta adjusts. But it is certainly very sweet. So this is the standard Azorius Convoke deck. And really, I don't know why we call it Convoke. Really, it's an Azorius aggro deck. And what this deck is effectively doing is putting a bunch of powerful but cheap creatures on the battlefield all at once so that you have a massive Regal Bunnicorn. You tap things down, get things out of the way, draw cards off of Enduring Curiosity, have a Steel Seraph power them up, and just overwhelm your opponent. It's a super fun deck to play if you like combat, because that's what this deck is attempting to do. Now, as far as the lands go, there's nothing really special happening. We have some man lands, but really it's just blue-white lands. There's no like hidden synergies. Besides, I guess we can, when you make the thing with Restless Anchorage, you can then tap it with Warden of the Inner Sky, or if you man up Soulstone Sanctuary, you can do a really similar thing. And really, this deck is divided up into creatures and non-creatures. And I'm just going to talk about the creatures first. First off, we have Novice Inspector. It's a 2/1 for 1 when it enters Investigate, which means create a clue token, which is an artifact. This card's decent because, one, it's just a 1-mana body, and we can cash in the clue for an extra card. But there's also extra synergy with Warden of the Inner Sky, which is another 1-mana 1/2. But it says when it has 3 or more counters on it, it has Flying and Vigilance, which is very powerful, and we can tap 3 untapped artifacts and or creatures to put a +1/+1 counter on it and scry 1. Now, Novice Inspector is a creature and an artifact, so it creates 2 permanence for that Warden of the Inner Sky, and to get very big and very powerful and be able to cash in on a frankly small body. Now, Spyglass Siren is also doing a really similar thing. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with flying. When it enters, create a map token. Now, a map is an artifact, which means it's creating 2 permanents for that Warden of the Inner Sky as well. But also it is flying, so it has a little bit more evasion. And you can cash in on these artifacts once they don't become relevant for Warden of the Inner Sky. We're playing 4 Flood Pitch Drowner. It is a 2-mana 2/1 with Flash and Vigilance. When it enters, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it so it doesn't untap for 1 turn. And we can pay 2 mana and tap it to shuffle Flood Pitch Drowner and target creature with a stun counter on it into the owner's library. So for 4 mana, it can get rid of a permanent forever, which is really sweet. But really, it's just getting things out of the way so that we can jam with our massive creatures or flood the board with our creatures. Speaking of massive creatures, a lot of what we're trying to do is capitalize on Regal Bunnicorn. Regal Bunnicorn is a 2-mana star, whereas power and toughness are equal to the number of non-land permanents you control. The cool part about this card is that enchantments, the artifacts we get from Spyglass Siren and Novice Inspector, all count as these non-land permanents. And so, you know, we play Spyglass Siren or Novice Inspector on turn 1, Regal Bunnicorn on turn 2, and it's already a 3/3, and really only gets bigger from there, especially if we kind of give it lifelink with a Sheltered by Ghosts and stuff like that. And so getting things out of the way, often we can just like Alpha Strike with a giant Regal Bunnicorn, which we absolutely love. As far as continue to talk about the creatures, playing 3 Enduring Curiosity. It's a 4-mana 4/3 with Flash. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. And when it dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it's an enchantment, and it can still has that curiosity effect. Cool part about this card is that a lot of our cards are evasive or absolutely massive, or get blockers out of the way, or make other things evasive, or things like that. And so being able to draw a bunch of cards in a deck where our plan is just to flood the board with creatures is super powerful. Steel Seraph is a 6-mana 5/4 with flying. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains your choice of Flying, Vigilance, or Lifelink until end of turn. However, it has Prototype for 1 white, and it's a 3/3. when you prototype it. So this can give evasion, this can give lifelink so that we don't die to the red decks. This can give vigilance so that we can block, which is probably the least common thing. Giving evasion to that Regal Bunnicorn or really any creature when Enduring Curiosity's out is very powerful. Also has flying in and of itself, and we can cash in and make it a 5/4 if we have 6 mana instead of 3, which is super strong as well. And then we're playing 4 Mockingbird. Mockingbird is blue and X, has flying. You may have Mockingbird enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the amount of mana spent to cast Mockingbird, except as a bird in addition to its other types and as flying. So we have that evasiveness, which is really important for like, you know, flooding the board and just dealing a bunch of damage, and Enduring Curiosity. But also we can copy any card we already have on the battlefield. We can draw 2 cards for every creature that lands, you know, if we have an if we want to copy an Enduring Curiosity, or maybe more likely copying a Warden of the Inner Sky or a Regal Bunnicorn or anything like that, or getting things out of the way by copying a Floodpits Drowner, and now it has vigilance and flying. It's just a very, very powerful card. Now, as far as non-creature spells go, we're playing 4 Sheltered by Ghosts. It's a 2-mana aura where you enchant a creature you control. When it enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghosts leave the battlefield. And then the enchanted creature gets +1/+0, has lifelink and ward 2. Putting lifelink on a giant thing like a Regal Bunnicorn is very strong. Again, this is a way to get things out of the way. Playing 4 of these main deck means that you're like 90% against the aggressive decks, which is really cool. And just all around a very powerful card. And then the rest are some flex slots, but are cards that I really like. Unidentified Hovership is a 3-mana vehicle that is 2/2. When it enters, exile up to 1 target creature with toughness 5 or less, and when it leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner manifests dread. So it doesn't actually give something back, it just has the manifest dread, which is we're totally okay with. The cool part about this is 2/2 with crew 1, so it removes something and creates an evasive way to cash in something like Novice Inspector. And they're paying a single Raise the Pass in the main deck. It's a 4-mana sorcery. Return all creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is very good against the decks that like wipe the board, especially with cards like Split Up or have a lot of removal, and that's how they want to deal with our many, many creatures. So really, we're just like, we have a couple combos within the deck, but the essence of the deck is we're putting a bunch of creatures on the battlefield and trying to overwhelm our opponent. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing Elspeth's Smite to deal with these aggressive decks. A 1-mana instant deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and it would die that turn, exile it instead. Also happens to be very good against the enduring cards as well. We're playing 3 Destroy Evil, destroying any problematic enchantments, like I'm thinking like Temporary Lockdown or something like that, but also getting rid of creatures with toughness 4 or greater. Rest in Peace as our graveyard hate. Split Up we can play in our deck because we can really make it a one-sided board wipe for any like Convoke-y mirror matches or aggressive decks where we can just like jam with everything, and then if they have things untapped, we just go untapped, or if they've been attacking, we untap and then we just stay tapped, and it's a one-sided board wipe, which is very, very powerful. We're playing 2 more Raise the Pass. It's a 4-mana sorcery. Again, return all creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Very good against decks with a lot of board wipes, against other Split Up decks. Very good against the black decks that are just removing your creatures as fast as possible. Protecting Negotiators, we're playing as a 2-mana instant that says if the spell is clicked, create a 1/1 white soldier token. And it says counter target spell unless controller pays 1 for each creature you control. Very good in this deck because we normally have a bunch of creatures anyway, and we want to be playing the Protect Negotiators against board wipes, things like Sunfall or Day of Judgment or Split Up or whatever, because very often we kind of have to overcommit to the board because that's sort of what we're doing as a deck, and we really, really don't want to be punished by that. And then we're playing 2 Tishana's Tidebinder. It's a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash. When it enters, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If an ability, an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. This happens to be really good against Temporary Lockdown because it just kind of like stops that stuff. There's a lot of really fun and interesting corner cases that this deck has. Very good against like Enduring Curiosity, Planeswalkers, and just making things textless. But this is the Azorius Convoke deck in Standard. It is so fun. This is the new Boros Convoke deck. Now, what this deck overall is attempting to do is put a bunch of permanents onto the battlefield, whether they be something that makes another permanent like a Novice Inspector, makes 2 things like Resolute Reinforcements, etc., and then capitalize on having all of those permanents on the battlefield by pumping up Warden of the Inner Sky an insane amount, being able to tap them to convoke Night Errant Evios, being a large body in and of itself, while grabbing more things to flood the field with, and Imidane's Recruiter, which pumps up all of your creatures and gives everything haste, and you can jam for a lot of damage that your opponent often didn't see coming. Now, what's the reason we're playing Boros now instead of Jeskai? And the big thing is the addition of this Aether Drift card, Nesting Bot. Now, it's a 1/1 for 1 that when it dies, create a 1/1 colorless artifact creature token, and it has max speed. This creature gets +1/+0. So what? This is the decent aristocrat card, but what are we going to do with it? Well, you see, it's an artifact in and of itself, and it being an artifact that we can target with Gleeful Demolition, and then not only target it with Gleeful Demolition, but be able to get another creature, so we immediately have 5 creatures on the battlefield, is incredibly powerful. Especially it is white itself, so it can just act like what you need to convoke Night Interviews. So this is the biggest reason we're replacing a Spyglass Siren, and then it just becomes about being really, really, really consistent rather than having to play all these different colors so that we have enough targets for Gleeful Demolition and enough things for Warden of the Inner Sky. So Nesting Bot allows us to do that. Now, Spyglass Siren has definitely some benefits, but this is just so much better because it's consistent, and we're an aggro deck. We really, really need to be consistent. So there's a couple of different categories that this deck creates. So I'm going to take just a second and show you them. So these are the different categories in the Boros Convoke deck. Now, as 3 major categories, we have kind of combo pieces, I would call it, like ways to flood the board, payoffs from flooding the board, and then this is removal. So let's talk about the removal first, and then we can talk about the meat and potatoes of the deck. Case the Gateway Express. Actually, I might even put this in the payoffs section. Yeah, so we're going to keep that in payoff section, actually. So as far as the early layers of the deck, we have Nesting Bot, which I've already talked about. Novice Inspector, which is a creature of itself, but also creates a clue, which is an artifact that can be targeted with Gleeful Demolition. Clockwork Percussionist, which is a 1-mana artifact creature with haste. When it dies, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. It's a 1/1. So we love that this is an artifact creature, so we can play it, be able to apply a little bit of pressure with it. And then when it either gets blocked or we Gleeful Demolition it, we effectively get to see and play the next card in our deck, which is amazing. And we have 4 Resolute Reinforcements. It's a 1/1 with Flash. When this creature enters, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Even better in the blue version of the deck because we can show Counterspell or that. But really, we're just playing this as a 2 creature for 1 card situation. Gleeful Demolition is a 1 red sorcery. Destroy target artifact. If you control that artifact, create 3 1/1 red Phyrexian and Goblin creature tokens. So what's cool about Gleeful Demolition is not only does it allow us to have main deck artifact tape, but we can target Nesting Bot, Novice, the artifact created by Novice Inspector, Clockwork Percussionist, or, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, the creature from Mirex, to create 3 more creatures, and in the case of Nesting Bot, 4 more creatures. So let's talk about Mirex, which probably should go in this category as well, because it's not a red or white land, except for the first turn it's played. Really, we're playing it, right? Tap it, and 3 mana to create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and the creature can't block. It's just another creature. Sometimes they answer our initial aggro and we need it to go long. Sometimes we need it as an artifact. It's just all around like a solid land to be playing in this deck. And then these are payoffs. And so the first payoff, Case the Gateway Express. So this is a 2-mana case. When it enters, choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. So if we have a bunch of creatures on the board, we can get almost anything out of the way. And then you solve it if you've attacked with 3 or more creatures this turn. We flood the board, so we attack with 3 or more creatures quite often. And when it's solved, creatures you control get +1/+0. So it's a removal, and also it's an anthem that is very, very easy to turn on. We're playing Warden of the Inner Sky, which is nice because it's a 1-mana creature. It's a 1/2, which is solid. And we can tap 3 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control to put a +1/+1 counter on Warden of the Inner Sky. Scry 1, activate only as a sorcery. So we can flood the board, put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it. And then what's cool is if it has 3 or more counters on it, it has flying and vigilance. So it can block big things, attack for a lot, in the air if we just invest some creatures into it. And really, we can very often just like play the creatures and tap the summoning sick ones to Warden of the Inner Sky, or just tap these artifacts like the Clue that we don't really care about. We're playing 4 Imidane's Recruiter. It's a 3-mana 2/2. When Imitator's Recruiter enters, creatures you control get +1/+1 gain haste until end of turn. So what's great about that is we get to flood the board. If we have some extra mana, some new creatures, because they'll get haste, Imitator's Recruiter, everything gets bigger, jam, and deal an insane amount of damage that your opponent doesn't expect. The adventure side of Imitator's Recruiter, just even though we'd play it anyway with that ability, is create 2/2/2 White Knight creature tokens with Vigilance. If we're casting that side, something's probably gone a little wrong. But it's nice because even though it's very mana intensive, it goes along with our initial game plan, and it's a way to like catch back up, especially since we can follow it up with Imitator's Recruiter. We're playing some Sanguine Evangelist. This could also be in the combo piece pile, but the reason I put it in the payoff category is because it has Battle Cry. So it's a 3-mana 2/1 that gets a 1/1 flying back creature token onto the battlefield when it enters or dies, which is kind of cool because it can survive some board wipes. It's a payoff because it has Battle Cry. If you attack with it, so not the same turn it comes out, so it's not as good as Imitator's Recruiter, it pumps your whole team +1/+0, which allows us to get a payoff for going super, super wide. We're playing War Leader's Call. It is a 3-mana enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1, so we already see why this is a payoff. And whenever a creature you control enters, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. So we're able to play it, pump up our team, attack for a whole bunch, likely more than their opponent was expecting, but then future creatures that we play can get that little extra reach, especially after a board wipe. And then the biggest payoff, in my opinion, is Knight Errant of Eos. It is a 5-mana 4/4. However, it has Convoke, which means you can tap creatures alongside lands to pay for this card, and every creature you tap counts as 1 mana of that creature's color. So we can play this as early as turn 2 by going turn 1 Artifact Thing, turn 2 Gleeful Demolition, Knight Errant of Eos. Or maybe even another 1-drop, and we can just tap creatures, which is an amazing start. So it's a big creature of itself. However, when Knight Errant of Eos enters, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal up to 2 creature cards with mana value X or less from among them, where X is the number of creatures that convoke Knight Errant of Eos. Put the revealed cards into your hand, then shuffle. So this card is essential to this deck because we get to have a nut hand, fill our hand with other things after we already apply a threat, which is really important. And it can grab nearly everything in our deck, even more Knight Errant of Eos if you used only Convoke creatures. So it's a giant payoff. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to fill the board. We're trying to play one of these payoffs or multiple of these payoffs after we fill the board and defeat our opponents with a very difficult to answer and weird aggro. As far as sideboard goes, Get Lost is great. Removal for big creatures so that we can attack out. Also deals with planeswalkers really well and enchantments like out of the domain deck. And we can use it on our own thing to create map tokens if we really need a target for Gleeful Demolition or Warden of the Inner Sky or whatever. We're playing 3 Invasion of Gobakhan because board wipes are really rough for this deck. Really, we're playing it for both sides, which is one of the only decks that actually likes both sides very much. When Invasion of Gobakhan enters, look at the target opponent's hand. You may exile a non-land card from it. For as long as the card remains exiled, this owner may play it. A spell costs 2 more this way. So we're able to delay the board wipe with this card. And the best part is the Light Shield Array, where at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn. So if we're able to defeat this siege, which only starts with 3 defense, it flips into this Light Shield array that will reward us for having a lot of creatures by pumping up our creatures every single turn if we attacked. And we can sacrifice it to have creatures you control gain hexproof and indestructible till end of turn, which allows us to effectively counter some board wipes or counter magic the turn before we kill our opponents. We're playing Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate. 3 Sheltered by Ghosts. It's a 2-mana enchantment. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 its lifelink and ward, and when it enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghosts leaves the battlefield. We're mostly playing this for the aggressive decks. It gets something out of the way, and we're able to gain a lot of life, especially if we put it on something like a Knight Errant of Eos. We're playing 1 Split Up for aggressive decks, as it can very easily be a one-sided board wipe against decks that are trying to race each other. Playing 2 Torch the Tower, again, for these aggressive decks. It gets things out of the way, it kills blockers, and then it exiles the thing. So we're able to have an answer to Heartfire Hero where we don't get dealt damage, which is really nice. And then we're playing 2 Urbrass Forge for these decks that go really long, but not the authority of the console decks, because Urbrass Forge just reads your opponent gains a life every turn if your opponent has authority of the console. Decks that are looking to answer us rather than race us, Urbrass Forge can kind of really push it over the top. So this is mono white control in standard. What this deck is effectively attempting to do is remove their opponent's creatures and then play Enduring Innocence and Caretaker's Talent. So let's look at these cards. Enduring Innocence is a 3-mana 2/1 that says whenever one or more creatures you control with power 2 or less enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And when Enduring Innocence dies, if it was a creature returned to the battlefield under its owner's control, it's an enchantment. Caretaker's Talent does something very, very similar for us. Caretaker's Talent is a 3-mana class where it says whenever one or more tokens you control enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. We can level it up to have it you create a token that's a copy of target token you control, and it's level 3 as creature tokens you control get +2/+2. So obviously, if we create a bunch of tokens when we have Enduring Innocence and Caretaker's Talent on the battlefield, then we end up drawing a bunch of cards. This is Miles, by the way. Hi, Miles. We end up drawing a bunch of cards, and it's really good for control decks to draw a bunch of cards. So we're going to be using Caretaker's Talent and Enduring Innocence to get that card advantage that control decks need. So how do we make those tokens? Well, we make those tokens with cards like Carrot Cake. Carrot Cake says when it enters, and when you sacrifice it, create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token and scry one. This 1/1 white rabbit creature token allows us to not only draw cards off of Enduring Innocence and Caretaker's Talent, but it's a threat in and of itself. Archangel Elspeth is a 4-mana planeswalker. +1 is create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. Boom, that triggers our draw. Its -2 is put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It becomes an angel in addition to its other types and gains flying. And its -6 is return all non-land permanent cards with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. All very good in this token deck. We are playing Overlord of the Mistmoors. Overlord of the Mistmoors is a 7-mana 6/6 that says when it enters and attacks, create 2 2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying, and we can impend it for 4 mana. These insects trigger Caretaker's Talent and Enduring Innocence, and it's a very, very scary threat in and of itself. Beza is yet another threat. Beza has a lot of text on it, but effectively Beza says it's a 4-mana legendary creature. When it enters, create a treasure token if opponent has more lands than you. Gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens if an opponent controls more creatures than you. And draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. So this is very good. It allows us to, by itself, get us a card advantage, but also creates tokens and creatures to trigger Caretaker's Talent and Enduring Innocence. On top of all of that, we're playing some Demolition Fields to deal with problematic lands, and then we're also playing Fountain Port. Fountain Port creates tokens. It creates you can tap it to add a colorless mana. We can pay 2 mana and tap it to create a token or sacrifice a token and draw a card. We have a bunch of tokens anyway, so that's awesome. We can pay 3 mana and tap it to pay a life and create a blue fish creature token. That blue fish triggers Enduring Innocence and Caretaker's Talent. And we pay 4 mana and tap it to create a treasure token. Again, it's a token, so it triggers Caretaker's Talent. So this land can have us kind of draw cards on a stick alongside Enduring Innocence and Caretaker's Talent as well. So those are our threats and card advantage engine. And then this is supported by 2 split up, saying destroy all tap creatures, destroy all untapped creatures. Very often this is just a one-sided board wipe. 4 lay down arms. Lay down arms says exile target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of planes you control. Its controller gains 3 life. We're running a ton of planes, so very often this is just a 1 mana remove a creature, and we don't care about our opponent gaining life because we're a control deck. When we win, it's by a lot. We're playing for Get Lost. Destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. Its controller creates 2 map tokens, which is pretty unconditional removal. We don't really care if our opponent deals with, has those tokens. And they're playing for Sunfall, an incredibly good board wipe. 5 mana, exile all creatures, incubate X for X the number of creatures exiled this way. The incubate is a token, so it triggers Caretaker's Talent, which is hilarious. So again, we're a control deck that is drawing a bunch of cards with these token synergies. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing Authority of the Consuls for aggressive decks. Elsa Smite, again, for aggressive decks as well. Also very good against the Enduring cards. We're playing Exercise as Enchantment Hate. Again, also very good against Enduring cards. Rest in Peace or Graveyard Hate. Split up mostly for aggressive decks, but the one-sided board wipe is solid. And the Stone Brain for decks that rely on specific and certain cards. So this is Boros Mice in Standard, and it is decidedly different than the Mice synergies in Gruul, which is like the premier aggro deck. This leans even further into those mouse synergies. And let's talk about the synergies first, and then we'll talk about the supporting cards. So these are all of the mice in the deck. Now, the primary synergies that you should be familiar with if you play Standard at all are the synergies among these cards. So Heartfire Hero is a 1 mana 1/1, has Valiant whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on it, which is very powerful. With then when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So when you pump it up with +1/+1 counters and pump spells like Monstrous Rage and things like that, and then it dies in combat, it deals a lot of damage, which is amazing. The other Valiant card we're playing that you should be familiar with is Emberheart Challenger, which is a 2-mana 2/2 with haste and prowess, which is already pretty powerful. We'd probably play that anyway, but it has Valiant. Whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library until end of turn. You may play that card. And so this obviously triggers off of these auras, off of Monstrous Rage, off of Shard Mage Rescue, all of that stuff, but it also triggers off of Manifold Mouse. Manifold Mouse is a 2-mana 1/2 with Offspring, which means you can make a 1/1 copy of it if you pay that additional 2 mana. At the beginning of combat in your turn, target mouse you control gains their choice of Double Strike or Trample until end of turn. So at the beginning of combat, Manifold Mouse can give Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger their Valiant triggers by giving them Double Strike or Trample. Normally you're going to be giving Double Strike. So that's great. This is already played in the red decks in Standard. But the additional mice that we're playing is Flowerfoot Swordmaster, which is a 1-mana 1/2 with Offspring 2. So again, you can pay that additional 2 mana and get a 1/1 copy of it. And it also has Valiant, so it will also trigger off of these auras and Monstrous Rage and Manifold Mouse. And whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, mice you control get +1/+1 till end of turn. And so this rewards you for having a lot of powerful mice on the battlefield and very much rewards you for going really, really wide with those mice. We're also playing Mabel, Heir to the Cragflame, which is a 3-mana 3/3, says other mice get +1/+1, which having a Lord is already great. The issue is it's legendary, but when Mabel, Heir of the Cragflame enters, create Cragflame, which is a legendary colorless equipment artifact token with equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has Vigilance, Trample, Haste, and Equip 2, which having that extra equipment, especially an equipment that gives vigilance, which allows us to block and attack, is very, very good. But really we're playing this as a Mouse Lord, and between the Mouse Anthem, Mouse Lord, and being able to easily trigger those Valiant abilities and having a lot of mice anyway, this is a really, really cool Kindred deck. That being said, we have some supporting cards. We do have some supporting creatures just to add to the aggro. We're playing Hired Claw, which is a 1-mana 1/2. Whenever you attack with one or more lizards, Hired Claw deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you can pay 2 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on Hired Claw. Activate only if an opponent has lost life this turn and only once each turn. Effectively, this is a 2-power 1-drop in practice, and it's a great mana sink. Sometimes you get flooded and you need to just make a creature huge, and Hired Claw can do that. And we're playing a single Screaming Nemesis in the main deck. It makes combat really weird for our opponent, and makes it so our opponent can't gain life if we're able to get Screaming Nemesis to have dealt damage, which we can do to ourselves with Burst Lightning or Lightning Helix. So that rounds out our creature suite. In addition to that, we're playing some burn spells to get things out of the way in Burst Lightning and Lightning Helix. Burst Lightning is a 1-mana just a shock, deals 2 damage to any target. However, you can kick it for an additional 4 mana, so 5 mana total, to have it deal 4 damage instead. This gets things out of the way. Burns face for that last bit of damage after they stabilize. And then same thing with Lightning Helix, say 2 mana, deal 3 damage, gain 3 life, and it fulfills the same role as Burst Lightning, just a little bit better against the aggro decks. And then we have additional ways to trigger Valiant that also do other stuff. Maybe the best card in the deck, Monstrous Rage, is a 1-mana instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Create a monster roll token attached to it. A monster roll is an aura that gives trample and +1/+1. So really this gives +3/+1 and trample, and the +1/+1 and trample stay on it. This triggers Valiant and then also makes combat really, really, really hard if your opponent has to play around it. We're playing for Sheltered by Ghost. Sheltered by Ghost is an aura. Auras trigger Valiant when you put them on a creature, which is great for this deck. When it enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghost leaves the battlefield, so it's an O-ring effect. An enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has lifelink and ward 2. So great against other aggro decks. This is an other aggro deck killer because it's just as fast, and playing the 4 Sheltered by Ghost and Lightning Helix is just disgusting. Gets things out of the way and triggers Valiant. And then we're playing 3 Shard Mages Rescue is a 1-mana flash aura. When it enters, enchanted creature has hexproof, and enchanted creature has +1/+1. So this card can mess up combat, but really we're playing this card to protect our creatures from opposing removal spells while also pumping up our creatures and triggering Valiant even easier. That being said, as far as the mana base goes, Restless Bivouac can just kind of get there when they wipe our board. We rely a lot more on creatures than the other red decks. But when it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It targets, so it triggers Valiant. So that's something really important to remember. And then we can kind of trigger Valiant on a stick for a lot less mana. With Rockface Village, we can pay 1 mana and tap it to have target lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon you control get +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. This also triggers Valiant, and we just need this land and like one other land to trigger Valiant every single turn. So it's all very, very powerful and really, really reliant on the mice and Valiant synergies. As far as the sideboard goes, Destroy Evil is for enchantments and creatures with toughness 4 or greater, like specifically for temporary lockdown, are very, very good against that card. Lithomantic Barrage allows us to deal with ththese like Haughty Djinns and Abernoculuses and things like that. Torture Tower, mostly for these other aggressive decks, makes other Heartfire heroes not trigger, and it's just a decent removal spell. Screaming Nemesis against decks that we're going to be doing a lot of combat with, so we can make combat really, really awkward. You have to remember Screaming Nemesis doesn't combo with our deck, or at least combo with our mice synergies though. And it's really good against decks that are gaining life, because we can just like burst lightning around Screaming Nemesis and not have to worry about that life gain. We're playing 2 Witchstalker Frenzy, because it's a 4-mana card that costs 1 less for each creature that attack this turn. It's really hard to make this only trigger 1 mana. Or only costs 1 mana, and deals 5 damage to target creature. We side this in against decks that have large blockers that we have a hard time attacking through. And then we're playing 3 Sunspine Links, which is a 4-mana 5/4. Players can't gain life, damage can't be prevented. And when Sunspine Links enters, it deals damage to each player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So we're going to be siding this in against decks that gain a lot of life, but also we're going to side this in against decks that play a lot of different colors and don't have a lot of basics, like Domain. So this is the Gruul Delirium deck. Really, this is just a Gruul aggro deck with like Delirium, silliness or Delirium strategies and whatever. Everything's very, very low to the ground. And as far as the lands go, there's not much to see here. We just have red-green lands, 3 Restless Ridgeline, having things come in untapped is really important, but also this is one of those decks that's a little weak to board wipes, so we have to be a little worried about that. So the man lands are pretty powerful. Now, what Delirium is having 4 different types of cards in the graveyard. And so having a lot of different types of cards in our deck is super important. So we have 2 artifact creatures, for example. We have planeswalkers, we have enchantments, instants, etc., etc. So it's really easy to get Delirium. So I'm going to divide stuff up really quick just so we can sort of talk about all of these things. So the essence of the Delirium deck is trying to fill our graveyard. So we're playing 4 Seed of Hope, where we mill 2 cards, and I may put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand. You gain 2 life. So putting cards in our graveyard, absolutely excellent. Also, most of the cards in our deck are permanent, so we will almost always hit something. Like really, like just the Seed of Hopes and this category are the non-permanent, so it's super unlikely we won't hit something. But more importantly, it's a May, so we can choose to not grab something if it happens to turn on our Delirium. We're also playing Dredger's Insight. Notably, this is an enchantment, which is a different type of card to make it a little bit easier to get Delirium. And whenever one or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard, you gain 1 life. So if you have Dredger's Insight or multiple Dredger's Insight, and then you like Seed of Hope, you can gain extra life because it's leaving your graveyard. And when this enchantment enters, mill 4 cards. You may put an artifact, creature, or land card from among the mill cards into your hand. So really, that's just like all the permanents in our deck besides like Wrenn and Realmbreaker. It's just another way to fill our graveyard and give us a little bit of card selection. Now, why are we trying to fill our graveyard? Well, a lot of these cards have Delirium and get a lot better with Delirium. For example, the 3 big ones are Patchwork Beastie, Wildfire Wickerfolk, and Fear of Missing Out. Patchwork Beastie is a 1-mana 3/3, which is disgusting. However, it can't attack or block unless you have Delirium, unless you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. However, it can help itself get Delirium by milling a card at the beginning of your upkeep. So it's just like very little mana investment for a very large creature. It's also an artifact creature in and of itself, so when it gets milled and put into your graveyard, it can help with Delirium quite a bit. So it's just a very, very good card. Wildfire Wickerfolk is a 2-mana 3/2 with haste, and it gets +1/+1 and has trample if you have Delirium. And again, it's very easy to have Delirium, so really it's just a 2-mana 4/3 with trample with haste. That's so good and so aggressive. And frankly, all these cards are meant to be bigger than they're supposed to be. Kind of reminds me of a Selesnya deck, and they're all kind of hard to deal with. Fear of Missing Out is the big Delirium payoff. When it enters, discard a card, then draw a card, so we can selectively attempt to get Delirium by discarding a card. It's also an enchantment creature, so it counts as 2 different card types. And if you have Delirium, whenever Fear of Missing Out attacks for the first time each turn, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, untap target creature. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So we get 2 combat phases, get things to untap. Fear of missing out alongside like a lot of this stuff is just absolutely disgusting. These are not delirium. However, Keen-Eye Curator can kind of capitalize on putting a bunch of different types of cards into our graveyard. Keen-Eye Curator is a 2-mana 3/3, already decently sized. However, you can pay 1 mana, exile a card from a graveyard, so it's great graveyard hate. But also, we're already putting a ton of different card types in our graveyard. And if we have 4 or more card types among cards exiled with Keen-Eye Curator, it gets +4/+4 and has trample. So yeah, it's a 6 mana investment because we have to pay the 1 every single time or whatever. But it can become a 7/7 with trample, and really, like, you can do it over the course of a few turns and just kind of mana dump into it and whatever. You can also do it at instant speed, so like threatening it with those cards in your graveyard as well is just like really, really disgusting. And then we have a little bit of a combo here. So Afterburner Expert wants to be in the graveyard because whenever you activate an exhaust ability, which is a new thing from Aether Drift, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Basically for free. And itself, it has exhaust, so it combos with itself. I mean, and we're milling a bunch of stuff, so it happens reasonably easy. We can discard it if you're missing out. We can put it in the graveyard with these guys. And that's great. But we're also playing Dragonautics Expert, which has 2 exhaust abilities. One is 1 mana, which is just kind of gross because we can like turn 1 Seed of Hope, we get Afterburner Expert in our graveyard, turn 2 Dragonautics Expert, whatever. And then we can just like spend 1 mana on turn 3, be able to spend 2 mana on something else to just bring this back to the battlefield. But it's 1 mana exhausts. Other creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And you can pay 4 mana to create a 4/4 red Dinosaur Dragon. I didn't realize it was both those card types. That's funny. Creature token with flying. So like this card is like pretty good in and of itself, especially giving some haste and whatnot. Like can really surprise people. But also getting Afterburner Expert back from the graveyard is just so good. And frankly, having a card we want in our graveyard is very good as well. So that's our primary game plan. Ren and Realmbreaker also really likes us milling a bunch of cards. Lands I control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. That doesn't really matter, but it's a 3-mana planeswalker of 4 loyalty. Its +1 is up to 1 target land you control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature with vigilance, hexproof, and haste until your next turn. Is still land, so it can attack and block, which is disgusting. Which, you know, having these planeswalker cards that are able to do that is very powerful. We can mill 3 cards, which again adds to Delirium. You may put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand, which is basically our whole deck, so it allows us to kind of draw and helps us get Delirium. And its -7 is you get an emblem with you may play lands and cast permanent spells from your graveyard, which if we ever do that in this deck, it's just over. Like, let's be real. So this likes us milling cards and having all these permanents and wanting to get Delirium as well. And then we have some removal because you can, or removal and combat trick, excuse me. As far as the combat trick we like go, Violent Urge is a 1 mana. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. And if there are 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard, that creature gains double strike until end of turn. We can kind of surprise and just win for 1 mana pretty easily with Violent Urge. We're playing a single Torch the Tower for these aggressive decks, and they're playing 2 Beastie Beatdown. Which is a Delirium card as well. Target creature you control and target creature opponent controls. It's a bite, right? It deals the creature you control deals damage to the creature opponent controls. However, if you have Delirium, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on the creature you control, so it can make your guy bigger, can get things out of the way, and attack even more. And so really, this is just a red-green aggro deck with some graveyard synergies, which is just really, really fun and good. As far as the sideboard goes, Torch the Tower for these aggressive decks. A Braid, decent against the aggressive decks. Also having that artifact hate is pretty important, especially while we're trying to figure out what artifacts and vehicles and stuff are good after Aether Drift comes out. Obliterating Bolt, get things with big butts out of the way. Pyroclasm is great against these aggressive decks because it doesn't really kill much in our deck at all. Wildfire Worker Folk will most of the time be a 4/3. It will kill Dragonautics Expert, which is a little annoying, but like that's it. So Pyroclasm's great. Screaming Nemesis is great against decks that are looking to block. Chandra Spark Hunter is just another planeswalker that is difficult to answer that can just apply a ridiculous amount of pressure by creating vehicles and discarding cards to put things in our graveyard to get better Delirium and all that stuff. Played a Witchstalker Frenzy. for against decks with big butts that like blocking, like Shieldred and Golgari and things like that. A single Paw Patch formation just as enchantment hate, and there's not really a lot of flyers that we really care about, so really it's just enchantment hate that we can cash in to draw a card. Tranquil Fillback as a creature for artifact enchantment hate, also great graveyard hate, especially mass graveyard hate. And then Haywire Might is for these artifacts and enchantments we care about as well. Also decent against aggro because you can gain 2 life. So this is Simic Crab. Now what this deck is attempting to do is fill their graveyard as fast as possible with as many instants and sorceries as possible so they can cast Tolarian Terror and Eddy Merc Crab for very, very cheap, trigger up the Beanstalk a bunch to draw a bunch of cards, and tempo your opponent out while swinging for a lot every turn. What's cool as well is this deck acts as sort of a self-bounce deck as well. Playing this town ain't big enough because it triggers up the Beanstalk. Also allows us to get creatures out of the way while returning things like up the Beanstalk and Stormchaser's Talent and stuff like that to our hand so that we can then replay it. That being said, let's go through the cards. First off, Rona's Vortex. This is a newer addition to the deck. It's return target creature or planeswalker you don't control to its owner's hand. And if the spell is kicked, put that permanent on the bottom of his owner's library instead. Now notice that the kicker is black. So yes, this is a Simic deck. It's actually started splashing black. We're playing some Gloomlake Verges over islands. And then in the sideboard, we have some more black cards we'd bring in alongside a swamp that we can grab with Analyze the Pollen and Bushwhack to become a pretty interesting Sultai deck. The thing about Rona's Vortex versus Unsummon is it needs to be your opponent's creature or planeswalker, while Unsummon can protect your own stuff, which is pretty important because we don't have a ton of threats in our deck. But for 4 mana, Rona's Vortex turns into not only getting something out of the way, but getting rid of it, and that's really good. We're paying for Sleight of Hand. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, the other in the bottom of your library. It's just a 1 mana spell. That's an instant sorcery that can enter the graveyard and give us that card selection that this deck really, really needs. Seed of Hope is sort of like another Sleight of Hand. Mill 2 cards, you may put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand, and then you gain 2 life. This is actually better than Sleight of Hand in this deck because it puts Seed of Hope in our graveyard, possibly putting an additional instant sorcery in our graveyard, and then we get to select a permanent if we want to, and our permanents are our threats, you know, that's important. Plus gaining 2 life and it being an instant is non-zero as well. We're playing 4 Stormchaser's Talent. Stormchaser's Talent is a pretty beautiful card for this deck. It's level 1, creating a 1/1 blue-red otter creature token with prowess, and really what we can do is keep returning Stormchaser's Talent and getting stuff out of the way with this town ain't big enough, replaying it, and getting another otter with prowess, and we're casting so many instants and sorceries that's just ridiculous. You level it up for 4 mana to return a instant sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, so whether we're still digging for stuff, we need an unsummon, or this town ain't big enough, it's great. And then it's level 3, which happens pretty rarely, but does happen because you draw so many cards, so we're able to hit our land drops. We're playing 6 mana. You may cast whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue-red auto creature token with prowess. So it's like a big end game, but really you're probably only going to do the first level, possibly level 2 if the game goes a little long. And then again, level 3 is super, super rare, but this is one of our threats and one of the best cards in our deck. We're playing 2 Unsummon, again, splitting with Rona's Vortex, mostly to get things out of the way, but also Unsummon is able to protect your creatures from removal spells because, again, we don't have a ton of threats, so it's important to protect them. We're playing 2 Analyze the Pollen and grab a basic land card, which is important for fixing our mana, especially since we have that sideboard swamp. And we can collect Evidence 8 to instead search for a creature or land card, which is really good since we bring in a couple 1-of creatures in the sideboard, but also it allows us to grab our threats, which is really important. Bushwhack is a fun card where we can search our library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle, which means, again, we can play less lands. We can fix our mana, but also you can have target creature you control fight target creature you do not control. So it's a decent removal spell as well because our creatures end up being pretty big, whether it be the prowess creature or Tolarian Terror or Eddy Merc Crab. We already talked about Seed of Hope. So Cash Grab is another instant, which is really sweet because we get to leave mana up all the time. Mill 4 cards, put a permanent card from among the mill cards you milled this way into your hand. If you control a squirrel or return a squirrel card to your hand this way, create a food token. Now the squirrel thing just isn't gonna happen. However, it allows us to dig for Up the Beanstalk or our threats and Stormchaser's Talent or Eddy Merc Crab Tolarian Terror. And puts instant sorcery cards in our graveyard, which is what we're attempting to do. Up the Beanstalk, one of my favorite cards of all time. It's a 2-mana enchantment. When Up the Beanstalk enters, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. So it replaces itself when you play it. It is a permanent, so you can grab it with Seed of Hope and Cash Grab. And then it allows us to draw a card whenever we cast This Town Ain't Big Enough or our threats. Speaking of This Town Ain't Big Enough, it's a 5 mana instant. However, it costs 3 less if you target a permanent you control, which we're going to be doing most of the time. Return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. Most of the time, we're going to be using This Town Ain't Big Enough to just like return Storm Chaser's Talent, get something our opponent controls out of the way, replay Storm Chaser's Talent. However, I've seen Simic players tap 5 mana and just get 2 things out of the way. I've seen Simic players protect their own creature with this. I've seen Simic players return up the Beanstalk so that they can redraw. So there's a lot of things you can do with This Town Ain't Big Enough, but really don't be afraid to target your own creatures and spend 2 mana on it. And then really the payoff cards under deck. Tolarian Terror is a 7 mana 5/5 with the ward 2, and it costs 1 less to cast for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. So our goal is by turn 3, really, we should be casting this for 1. And then we're playing Eddie Merc Crab, which is 7 mana as well. However, double blue has a similar thing. Costs 1 less for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. Enters tapped, it's not your turn. However, when it enters, you can tap up to 2 target creatures. So between This Town Ain't Big Enough, between Eddie Merc Crab, Bushwhack, Unsummon, Rona's Vortex, we're just getting things out of the way as we jam for a lot of damage all at once. And really, like, having a Tolarian Terror out, end step Eddie Merc Crab, tap down your 2 creatures, untap, jam for 10 is super powerful, especially since the following turn you can like fight something or just unsummon like something. It's just so good. So again, we're trying to fill our graveyard as fast as possible, play these powerful threats, and then just get things out of the way and try to win in just an attack or 2. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, I want to start with the Swamp. If we sideboard in any of these black cards, which often we're going to do together, we're going to bring in the Swamp and take out a island. And then we can grab that Swamp with Analyze the Pollen or Bushwhack. And really, we're going to be digging with like Cash Grab and Seed of Hope. And then we can also hit the Gloomwraith Verge to be able to hit our black source, to be able to cast the black spells that we bring in. Shrouded Shepherd, we are never going to cast the white side. However, it is technically a permanent, so we can grab it with Seed of Hope and Cash Grab. And it's technically a creature, so we can grab with Analyze the Pollen as well, so that we can cleave shadows. In its adventure, creatures your opponent control get -1/-1 until end of turn. Very strong against a lot of the aggressive strategies, especially the Convoke strategies. That just happens to be a quote-unquote permanent. Minor Misstep, very good against the aggressive stuff. Also really good in like mirror-esque matches. Negate is great against dozens of cards. I don't think I have to go through all of them. Tishana's Tidebinder, good again against dozens of cards from like Zur and the Overlords to Temporary Lockdown or whatever. Anoint with Affliction, having this exile effect, exile target creatures, mana value 3 or less, is very strong because it's able to hit Heartfire Hero without you being dealt damage. It's also very good against Enduring Innocence and things like that. And it's also just like a decent removal spell besides that. Go for the Throat is a pretty unconditional removal against decks we need a bunch of removal against. And then Nowhere to Run's kind of a fun card where it's conditional because it only gives -3/-3. However, we can return it with This Town Ain't Big Enough so that we can keep replaying it. So it's very good in a deck like this, similar to the Dimir and Esper self-bounce decks. We're playing a single Pick Your Poison. Each opponent sacrifices a creature artifact of their choice, or each opponent sacrifices an enchantment of their choice, or each opponent sacrifices a creature with flying of their choice. Very good against the enchantment decks, really, is what we're playing it for. We're playing 2 Tear of Sunder, mostly for artifact or enchantment hate. However, we can side in that Swamp to exile target non-land permanent instead. So against decks that we really think we're going to have to grind against, I'm thinking like black green or something like that, it's decent to be able to just spend 4 mana and destroy a permanent, or exile a permanent rather. We're playing Keen-Eyed Curator as graveyard hate. Exiles a card from a graveyard for 1 mana. It's a 2/2 for, or excuse me, it's a 3/3 for 2. And as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards exiled, Keen-Eyed Curator gets +4/+4 and trample, so it can become a pretty nasty threat and a decent mana dump. And we're playing the Swarm Weaver, which again is a permanent we can grab with Seed of Hope and Cash Grab, and a creature we can grab and Analyze the Pollen. And when Swarm Weaver enters, create 2 1/1 black and green insect creature tokens with flying. And with Delirium, and we can pretty easily get Delirium, as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, insects and spiders you control get +1/+1 and have Death Touch. This is just a great mid-rangey card when we need more threats, and something we can bounce with Unsummon and This Town Ain't Big Enough pretty easily. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. I can't believe you made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.